I love the opening of Apocalypse Now, but in truth, it was a total accident, and I'd like to tell you the story how it came about. I was visiting the editing room of Apocalypse to visit the then editor, Barry Malkin, who had just heard word from some matters at home that he was going to have to return and wasn't going to be able to stay. And so I wanted to spend that last Saturday with him. And while I was waiting, I was wandering around the editing room and I noticed these barrels filled with film. And I said, "What are these barrels?" And they said, "Oh, that's Phil." And Phil was the parts of the film from the 5 cameras that had photographed the napalm run. There were 5 or 6 cameras, and during the part while they were waiting for the napalm, the cameras just rolled, and then they cut those off and threw them away in the barrel not to be used. And I said, "Oh, let me see." And I took one of these pieces of film just with my hand, and I put it in a moviola, and I said, "Oh, this is nice. It has helicopters going back and forth and smoke. It's very unusual." And then I reached over to another bin where there was some music, and I said, "Wouldn't it be funny if we took a song called The End and put it at the beginning of a movie?" And so I took this roll of waste garbage film that was going to be thrown away, and I put it in the moviola next to this discarded film, and I played it. And it was essentially the opening that Apocalypse Now has. And it was totally an accident. Had I not been there on that Saturday, had I not just reached into this barrel and gotten that particular piece of discarded film and not seen that song and thought it was funny to start a movie with a song called The End, I mean, I was half serious, this opening would not have existed. Of course, our very talented editors took that idea and, in fact, Walter Murch became involved and created a montage out of this hypnotic song by Jim Morrison and the Doors and created this strange entry into the character Willard's mind through this accidental finding of a piece of film and some music. And then, of course, I had photographed the fan in his room because lying on his back after a big drunk, perhaps I thought he would be looking up at his fan. It never really occurred to me that the blades of the fan could be used with the helicopter sounds to link all this together in this poor man's memory of his past experience in Vietnam. And with the shots that I did in that hotel room, pictures of his wife, the fact that he slept with an automatic gun in his bed, tried to give a little sense of who this character was right in the very, very, very beginning.
Lost in a romance, wilderness of pain.
Incidentally, I went to the UCLA Film School, and all the fellows who were the Doors also were all film students. Jim Morrison and Raymond Zarek and the others were our colleagues at school, and we knew each other. And so I feel very fond that the music of the Doors became such a part of Apocalypse Now. Martin Sheen plays the character of Willard, and I was very concerned of how I could show really what he had in his insides, what past had existed in this character, to try to bring out to the audience before he goes on this great journey, because I felt that that would be very important to know. This scene coming through the Venetian blinds and seeing Saigon outside, of course, we reconstructed in the Philippines where we shot the picture. I remember that day we had many, many taxis and people. It was sort of a hectic first day, I think, or early day, and we never quite got it to look the way I want. And oddly enough, the only view we really had of all that work was the one through the Venetian blinds. So very quickly in the story, we begin to enter into Willard's mind and his soul.
When I was home after my first tour, it was worse. I'd wake up and there'd be nothing.
We had the beautiful narration, which was later written by Michael Hare, who joined me as a colleague and provided many of these words that appeared in the final narration. Again, I had this task of how could I show what was in Willard's soul, because I knew that throughout the movie you were going to be with this character and you were going to be sort of looking at his face. Martin has an especially, I think, beautiful face. He's a very handsome man, and I thought that was perfect to kind of have him as the eyes upon which all these wonders and strange occurrences were going to happen. But if he was only a face without a kind of very textured soul that the audience could grasp, and I knew I had to do that right at the beginning, and I was very worried about this. And One night I was asleep and I had a dream, and it was a dream of something like a scene like this. And in the dream, I realized that the secret to Marty, getting Marty to reveal what he had inside, was in his vanity. In my dream, I thought this, and that if I got him and provoked him to look at himself in a mirror, that somehow that would bring out the devils that were in him. And so I did this. I literally provoked Marty in this sequence, and I taunted him about himself and how handsome he was, and didn't he know he was handsome, and to confess that, didn't he always think that when he looked in the mirror? And somehow I had an instinct, and as I said, it was in a dream, that this would bring out something in Martin that lay in many levels of the man's soul and personality, and indeed it did. And this sequence in which he moves from the mirror into this strange dance in his underwear, reaching down into really all the terrible things that he might have seen. And ultimately, he smashed the mirror and his hand began to bleed. And I was sitting up on a piece of the furniture, and I knew that I should say cut because he might have hurt his hand. And yet, if I said cut, it would mean that the scene would be stopped and ruined, and all of this that he had gone through would have been lost. And so I sat up there and I bit my tongue. And I allowed it to go on against partly my better judgment, and there was I, as the director, wanting him to have the scene, which I knew he wanted to have, and yet at the same time I said, my God, I'm responsible for this guy. And so finally, when we did cut and immediately gave medical attention to his hand, I felt badly. I'm not sure his wife appreciated that I allowed him to go on longer after he had cut his hand. It was an accident, and I was responsible, but nonetheless I did, and the scene is as it is because of that decision. And in a sense, I got what I want, because from this point on, when you continue with this character, you have a sense of who he is and what he feels and perhaps what he's been through. And so you interpret everything that's about to happen to him from that context of what you've seen. So in this scene we're watching now, two of the soldiers come up and have some orders for this man who's been on a bender in a hotel in Saigon. He's been sleeping off his drinking, and his sheets and his room are covered in blood from this strange night. I always imagined the type of operations he did. He spent many, many, many nights in the jungle alone, eating what he could, and so he was used to a very solitary kind of strange existence.
Trying for me. That's right.
At this point, he gets his orders. They want him, and they want him to come to headquarters, and he's in no shape to go.
Dave, come here and give me a hand. We got a dead one. Come on, Captain. Let's take a shower.
We literally took Martin and put him in this ice-cold shower to wake him up and to get him ready to go see his commanders. Sometimes the director feels badly about some of the things he puts the actors through, but, knowing at the same time that actors love to be able to perform things that will be memorable, that will be looked at for years and years. And so on one hand, you're doing something that is terrible, and on the other hand, you're doing something that's wonderful in that they live forever in what they've been able to achieve. Here was an indication of, how the Americans approached Vietnam. Interestingly, they approached Vietnam very much the way I approached making the film in Vietnam. They have air-conditioned trailers, and they have money for equipment, and they have good food. And I wanted to portray this, and the production designer, Dean Tavaleris, and his team wanted to show that with the set that they provide of an air-conditioned world that they lived in. This is, of course, the young Harrison Ford. He had been in a film working with me in The Conversation, and from that he went off to work on my friend George Lucas's film, The First Star Wars, and it was arranged through our mutual casting director, Fred Roos, that Harrison would, having just shot Star Wars, come to the Philippines and shoot this scene in Apocalypse Now as the young officer who briefs him. The civilian gentleman is Jerry Ziesmer. He was the first assistant director of the movie and was perfect as this kind of government or CIA official. The other gentleman playing the part of the general is J.D. Spradlin, who had been so effective in Godfather 2 and played the general in that orientation scene. And I must say that J.D. Spradlin always came up with wonderful improvised lines, which he didn't improvise. He actually was writing them at home. And lines like, the Lincoln quote, "The better angels of our nature," or "Gentlemen, try the shrimp and you'll need no other sign of valor during the war." Those were all J.D. Spradlin added lines. I guess he was padding his part, but I never mind because he always did it so well.
bad hand there. Are you wounded? A little fishing accident on our...
I think that when I was doing this, Harrison had traveled long distance and was very exhausted, and I think he was a little nervous doing all of this dialogue. I remember we shot this scene many times, just over and over again, and I can't deny that maybe I was like searching for what would make it unique and what would give it something memorable.
Captain, I don't know how you feel about this shrimp, but if you eat it, you'll never have to...
And when I saw that Harrison was like a little nervous, and it might have been that he wasn't nervous, that he was exhausted, but I felt he was trembling and a little nervous with his lines, and so I decided, well, that was what the character would be, and so I deliberately had him drop his dossier and drop the pages all over the floor to sort of use the nervousness as though it was part of the scene. I think that's a familiar technique that directors do. They note whatever is seems to be there in the reality of shooting it, and then try to make that part of the scene. Obviously, to do this movie, we had to make many items, photographs, and documents for the dossier, and looking for old photographs of Marlon Brando from other movies, and to try to trick that into being like a Green Beret colonel. It was the prop work, which was done by Doug Madison, was very, very extensive, and part of props is food. And in my films, I like to have actors eat, and I like the food that they're eating to be real. And it's interesting how often the food and the plates and the props give rise to ideas for the actors that make the scenes memorable.
You must incinerate them, pig after pig.
Now, as people know, Apocalypse Now was an original screenplay by John Milius. It was originally hatched by John Milius and George Lucas, who were buddies from USC, and my new company, American Zoetrope, wanted to sponsor them in making this film, and so I arranged that they could have money to pursue it, and John to write it, and George Lucas was going to direct it. And many, many steps happened between that idea and ultimately myself directing it, which I'll talk about at different times. But ultimately what happened is when it was time to do Apocalypse Now, George was already involved on Star Wars and couldn't do it, and I went to John Milius, who I thought was an excellent director. He had done his first film, Dillinger, which I thought was great, and he was doing something else, and I had the script, and I guess I ended up owning it because of the business situation that had brought the payment of it to me. Ultimately, the script fell to me, and I thought, well, here's this movie. If I did it sort of as a big war film, which was the fashion in those days, things like, The Longest Day or Bridge Too Far or what have you, maybe Zoetrope could make a great big commercial war film and we'd make a lot of money. And then I would have my real desire, which was to make little personal movies.
Now he's crossed into Cambodia with this Montagnard army of his that worship the man.
Interestingly, George Lucas's idea of how to do the film was he wanted to make it in 16 millimeter and go somewhere in Northern California and see if they could get 2 helicopters and do it kind of in a total documentary style, which, if you think about it, was a wonderful idea and would have worked very well. My idea was directly opposite, diametrically opposite. I wanted to make it as a great big Hollywood war movie. If I could have made it in Cinerama, I would have. I wanted it to have the biggest picture, the greatest sound. In fact, in those days, there was a new process that had been invented by Universal Pictures called Sensurround. And Sensurround was a thing where when the movie was shown, if there was an explosion, all the seats of the theater would rumble and the whole theater would rumble. And I literally called up Lou Wasserman, who was the head of Universal, because they told me if you wanted to get Sensurround, he has to give it to you. And he said to me, Sensurround is a star. Sensurround is Steve McQueen. If you want to use Sensurround, you have to pay us a piece of the gross. Well, all Sensurround was a big loudspeakers that rumbled, so we did it anyway. I mean, we didn't use their patent. But I illustrate this only to show that my whole idea was somehow my instinct was to make Apocalypse Now as big a Hollywood production as I could possibly make. And interestingly, it put me into a situation where I went to the Philippines to make this film with a lot of money, a lot of crew, a lot of production and equipment. And in a funny way, the auspices that I made the film was very much like the Americans going to Vietnam with all that money and all that equipment and all those amenities that they brought with them, air-conditioned trailers and fine food. And so in a funny way, I was doing something I think I've always been interested in throughout my career, which was to try to make films which are what they're about, that the films are literally made out of the same flesh and blood of the theme. so that the auspices you use to do it, the way you choose to mount it, the type of crew, or whether you do it with a lot of money or without any money, it depends on what the theme of the film was, because by doing that, by putting myself in a situation very much like the United States, I was going to make a film that in its essence perhaps could, be the Vietnamese War.
Terminate. The colonel. He's out there operating without any decent restraint, totally beyond the pale of any acceptable human conduct.
Jerry Ziesmer is a very bright guy, and he immediately nailed who that CIA agent was.
Terminate with extreme prejudice.
And just sat there and looked, and then said the line, terminate with extreme prejudice, which was a phrase, I believe, that John Milius had picked up from a Life magazine article on a military trial against a Colonel Rolt, who was literally, like Kurtz, being put up against military charges of murder because he had assassinated North Vietnamese counter-agents, which really was the genesis of the idea of a contemporary Colonel Kurtz, or Mr. Kurtz, in the Vietnam War, who had run amok. The music for Apocalypse Now was basically inspired by music I heard from the Japanese artist named Tomita, who in the days of the 70s had come out with a series of beautiful, beautiful records, entirely synthesized music. And I went to Tomita and tried to get him to be the composer of this film, and unfortunately, because of his contract, he was not able to do it. And so ultimately I went to my father, Carmine Coppola, and asked him if he would compose a classical score but collaborate with me, because I intended to take my father's score and orchestration and put it through basically the synthesizer, so that the bass would be the rumble of the helicopter and the strings would be the wind. And that's how the score of Apocalypse Now was arrived at, and it took many, many, many months to do. Interestingly, on this boat, if you look carefully, Captain Willard is not Martin Sheen, but is actually Harvey Keitel.
I took the mission. What the hell else was I gonna do?
Harvey Keitel had been cast in the part of Willard at the beginning, and I always admired Harvey as an actor, and I do to this day. Although I always felt that his style of acting, even at the time that we cast him, was a very active style that really commands you to look at him, in which he does all sorts of interesting things. My instinct was to have an actor, rather, who did the looking at things, rather than that demanded you look at him. And in the first days, I began to wonder if perhaps I wanted a more passive kind of actor, and with a different kind of face. And I really agonized of this. One never wants to replace an actor, and certainly not a great one like Harvey Keitel, who is a friend and who became even a better friend over the years. But the time I sat and, there I was on the spot. I was the financier, I was the producer, I was the director, and we were at the beginning of a long, long period, and I made the decision to possibly change. And at that point, Martin Sheen had become available. He had been an actor that I was interested in at the beginning, but he wasn't available. And so I made that change, very painful decision. But obviously, Martin was someone very right for the part. The other cast members, Lawrence Fishburne, he was 14 when I cast him. I wanted someone to really look young, to look like a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, because the soldiers in Vietnam were so young, and I went to the extreme of hiring a 14-year-old actor so he would really look young. Albert Hall is the captain, a wonderful presence, spiritual presence on the boat. And of course, the character Chef was Freddie Forrest, who had been my friend and one of the actors Fred Roos and I love so much. And he played Chef. And for the part of Lance, the young California surfer, we had Sam Bottoms of the marvelous Bottoms family from Santa Barbara. And this was to be our crew. We had auditioned many actors. We had shot tests. And this was the cast that I arrived at, and that we were going to take on this adventure. My father did not want to play the solo flute parts that were used to accompany the dossier scenes when Willard is examining the pictures and photographs and commendations of Colonel Kurtz. There's a solo flute playing, and I prevailed upon my father, who was by then probably approaching 70, to play the flute, because he had been one of the great flutists of the world. And he said, no, I can't do it. I don't have the chops. And I said, no, please, practice, do it. And my father did it. And I must say, I'm really happy about it because I have that now. I have my father playing the flute in those many sections. And, it's an exposed flute. It's a solo flute, so you really hear his tone and his intonation and his phrasing. And it's a thrill that we have that now for our children and grandchildren and so on. When they see Apocalypse Now, they can actually hear my father playing on his magical silver Powell flute.
Transferred to airborne training, Fort Benning, Georgia, and was finally accepted. Airborne. He was 38 years old. Why the fuck would he do that? 1966, joins Special Forces. Returns Vietnam.
Hey, what's that?
The sequence of the Arclight, which were the B-52 bombers with these incredible explosives that literally pounded the eardrums. This, interestingly, was a sequence where I had intended to use Sense-Around, and when we did the mix, did experiment with our own kind of Sense-Around to give that rumble in the seats.
Let's have a look, Chief.
It was the air cab, first of the night.
That's them.
Our escorts to the mouth of the Nawh River. But they were supposed to be waiting for us another 30 kilometers ahead. Well, air mobile. Those boys just couldn't stay put.
We began the sequence of the preliminary attack to this area. I remember we were cut off from communication. I don't know whether it was a typhoon or there were no transportation. And the reason I remember that is because the actors we had hired to be the television crew commenting to the soldiers about not to look at the camera weren't able to get to the location. And since we didn't have the actors, I guess we decided that I would do the part of the news commentator. And Dean Tavaleras, who was the production designer, would do the other photographer, and Vittorio Storaro, the photographer, would be the third. And so, in fact, here we are standing in for the actors who didn't make it, doing this little kind of Hitchcock appearance in Apocalypse Now. This, I think, was one of the first scenes we tackled with so much going on, and we had helicopters coming and going, and flamethrowers and tanks and extras and Vietnamese people. I think there were 5 languages going on the set. There was the crew were Italians. Vittorio and all his crew were from Italy. There were Vietnamese people who were actually speaking, and we had to give instructions in Vietnamese. There were the Filipinos who spoke Tagalog. There were English people. There were French people. I mean, there was a Tower of Babel here at the same time that all this activity is going on. The sequence was added back for Apocalypse Now Redux. This was an extraordinary character that John Milius created, Colonel Kilgore. And originally his name, I remember in the first script I read, was Colonel Carnage. Now, at the time of Apocalypse Now, the head of the Department of Defense was, well, guess who? Donald Rumsfeld. He was the head of the DoD then, and when they read the script of Apocalypse Now, they absolutely turned us down, and they made it very clear that they would make no equipment available to us and give us no Department of Defense support, which often Department of Defense will do for movies that it feels more reflects the message it wants to give about itself. And we were in a tough spot because we needed helicopters, we needed Army equipment as well as help in every possible way. And it was for that reason that we chose to go to the Philippines, where President Marcos had a lot of American equipment, had a lot of helicopters. Many of the things that John put in the script, such as the famous death cards where they would survey the terrible slaughter and death, and they would rate them according to how horrible it was with these death cards.
Death card! What? Death card! Let's Charlie know who did this!
In some of the scenes, you'll notice the various war correspondents. There are several women in particular. One is Mary Ellen Mark. I guess she was the Christiane Anapur of those days, going to difficult combat situations, photographing various things, and she was well known. And she came for a long period to work during Apocalypse Now. I think the lure of getting to photograph Brando, which she did, brought her. Also, there was a famous war photographer named Nancy Moran. Of course, with the photographers, I just dressed them in fatigues and said, just go in the scenes and shoot, because we'll photograph you as war photographers. This scene is very much a John Milius sentiment, where you have a Viet Cong suffering, literally holding his intestines in with a wash bucket, asking for water, and the South Vietnamese soldiers, they don't give him water, and that there's a sense of honor to John in war, that Colonel would give the suffering man water because of his courage. They say that in some way the character was based on certain air cav commanders. I even heard once the name of General Patton's son as a very colorful commander in Vietnam. Of course, General Patton wore ivory-handled pistols during his war term. And yet so quickly he turns away when he hears that there is a star surfer there. Our young character, played by Sam Bottoms, Lance. It turns out that Colonel Kilgore is a surfer himself and a great fan, and they've all heard of Lance. I was very lucky to have the great actor Robert Duvall, who had been, of course, in The Godfather and in The Conversation, get a hold of this very, very exotic character to bring it to life and yet not make it be so absurd that it's just a cartoon character, which, of course, one always worries about. Again, this is pure John Milius. Comes from his mind. It was in his screenplay. But I'm told from John that indeed they did things like this in Vietnam. They did surf. And when you're in the midst of this kind of carnage and devastation and horror, it is amazing what the human being will seek out to be interested in. These scenes began to be so surreal to me that I think the whole direction of Apocalypse Now began to change, and it began to go from a so-called war film into this journey into the surreal. I mean, you have a Catholic mass going on while they're airlifting a cow. I mean, you have to just wonder, my God, what is going on? And because it was the American Army, they had air-flown probably New York steaks there, and he rewarded his men, the cavalry, which of course was indeed the American cavalry, who had rode horses in earlier wars, and in the Civil War now were flying helicopters, but they were the cavalry, and they still wore their cavalry accoutrement, and there they were with all this incredible food, steaks on the barbecue, and indeed Robert Duvall here is singing a song that I think he wrote, if I'm not mistaken.
He loved his boys.
We have Freddie Forrest. Interesting story about Freddie Forrest. He played a character known as the chef, and actors kind of click into who they are and feel comfortable with their roles at different times. So whereas one actor might be there in the first week, another actor may not find his character for 3 weeks or even more. And Freddie was one of the last actors to be comfortable with what he was doing, what his character chef was. And I remember when that happens, I always invite the actor to have dinner with me alone to see if I can be of help. And Fred said to me, "I don't know, Francis. I'm just not here. I'm not here. I'm somewhere else. I'm walking down the street in Beverly Hills with my girlfriend, and I'm gonna go in and get a Coke and a hamburger." And I said to him, "Freddie, that's your character. Just keep thinking that. Just in the middle of all this, just keep thinking, I'm not here. I'm not really here. I'm walking down the street in Beverly Hills." And he began to do that, and that led ultimately to him discovering, who he was. I've often thought of the wonderful story, I think Gene Hackman told me that on The French Connection, he said it was 3 weeks into the show and he didn't know who his character was. He said, I would get funny hats, I was doing this and I was doing that, but I didn't know who the hell this Popeye Doyle character was. And one day in New York in the morning, I grabbed a donut and I dipped it in a cup of coffee and I took a bite out of it and then I threw the donut away and I heard, "That's him, that's the character." And it was Billy Friedkin who had been watching. And he said, when that was pointed out to me, that's who he was, the guy who took one bite out of the Dunk Donut and threw away. He says, then I knew who I was. So this kind of happens, and actors fall into who they are, discover themselves. But I must say, thanks to John's incredible script, that Robert Duvall knew who he was from the moment he put that hat on and put those boots on.
Lance, go with Mike, let him pick out a board for you, and bring me my Yater spoon, the 8-6.
I don't know, sir. It's
What is it, soldier?
Well, I mean, it's pretty hairy in there. It's Charlie's point.
Charlie, don't surf!
It's so ludicrous. I mean, here they are going on a cavalry charge with a bugle, a sounding charge, and kind of running by with surfboards. But the more I worked on this, I began to think, my God, this is totally surreal. And by then, I wasn't taking the script anymore to the set. I was taking this green copy of a paperback of Heart of Darkness, which I had 1 million notes and marks in, and I would, at every scene, I would look at that. The script supervisor, Nancy Tonnery, had the Amelia script, but I would check Heart of Darkness, and I began to realize this isn't really a war film after all. This is something else. This is a journey into some kind of surreal weirdness, a journey into issues related to morality in modern time, when we have the reach through our technology to amplify all of these evil instincts or negative instincts, because ultimately we lie about what we're doing, which was a central theme to Heart of Darkness, but because we lie, that is the kind of Vaseline that enables these terrible things to happen. Because if you tell the truth, you couldn't possibly support some of the actions that go on. And because everything is mechanized and extended by technology, the lie can produce fantastically grotesque and destructive things. And at the same time, there's a beauty to it, which I felt that this ballet of the helicopters with music, again, I say inspired by the work that Tomita was doing. For those of you who go buy an RCA album of any of the Tomita records, Snowflakes Are Dancing was the Debussy one. You can see where the inspiration came. Although I must say that it was my father who wrote every note. I mean, when he would write score, it was, scored for a 70-piece orchestra. And then through tremendous, really painstaking effort, an entire team of synthesis led by Niall Steiner and others actually took the score of Apocalypse that my father, and with my guidance, trying to find orchestral voices out of the sounds of Vietnam, we arrived at this unusual score.
That's a roger, big dude. Okay, we're going in. We'll come in low out of the rising sun, and about a mile out we'll put on the music. Music? Yeah, use Wagner. It scares the hell out of the slopes. My boys love it.
Hey, we're gonna play music!
We're always listening to what people told us. I mean, someone mentioned that the soldiers would sit on their helmets to protect their private parts in case they got shot at from below. And I've always tried to be very available to whatever I hear, whatever I learn. I think being a film director, the most wonderful thing of being a film director is what you learn, because you're so sensitized, you're so hungry to have information that you just search for everything, and then whatever you can receive, if you can make use of, if you can be available to it, you're able to put it right in context of the script. Or in this case, I was there with the script in my left hand and the Heart of Darkness in my right hand, and my eyes wide open, and I made the film really that way. Now, this is arguably one of the most famous sequences from Apocalypse Now, and I've been asked many times where it came from, and it's very simple to answer. This sequence came from the mind and imagination of John Milius. He wrote it in the original script. It had the what are known as psyops operation, where the military would blare and play music to frighten and demoralize the enemy. And John had written that they played the Wagner Flight of the Valkyrie. And for my part, I directed the sequence that John had written, and tried to, of course, extend it into an entire battle scene of greater length than merely the onslaught. I added this tranquil Vietnamese village with the children in school, and usually the way I work is I write out a whole series of vignettes on little index cards. I did the same on The Wedding of the Godfather, and I'll write, little girl dances on the shoes of her uncle, or Vietnamese school children are studying, but they hear the oncoming noise of the helicopters and are evacuated. And I write these various sequences on little white index cards, and then as we're shooting this kind of thing, I kind of try to realize each little vignette. And in this case, there was the bridge provided by the art department by Dean Tavaleris, and I thought, well, it would be interesting if they had to resupply the machine guns on the other side of the bridge. And so a little vignette of a Citroen trying to get across the bridge would be another vignette, and so forth and so on. From talking to the veterans, I collected maybe 20, 30 vignettes, and then I kind of pared that down to a number of them, and then set about during this period here, and just shot by shot tried to do it. And then, of course, there was a massive amount of film, which really took one editor who I gave untold hours of footage. I mean, it was so much, it was unbelievable. The editor was Jerry Greenberg, and he worked on the sequence diligently for weeks, if not months. And he's the one who created this extraordinary action sequence. And I remember even giving the sequence late in the game when it was almost done to the great master Akira Kurosawa, and he suggested a few things. I was very excited because, I mean, you can imagine how we all look up to Akira Kurosawa, and the fact that he didn't give me too many suggestions, just one or two, and praise the sequence was a source of great pride.
Outstanding, red team, outstanding. Get you a case of beer for that.
But here you see work done by the Italians, Vittorio Storaro, his extraordinary camera operator, Enrico Metelli, and Alfredo, the dolly operator. It was amazing what they did in such difficult circumstances. You have to realize that we had the entire Filipino Air Force, all their helicopters there to work on this. And sometimes we would be planning a sequence and we'd be just about to shoot, or we had been shooting, and all of a sudden all the helicopters would get up and leave. And I would say, where are they going? Where are my helicopters going? Don't let them go. And the word had happened that one of the insurrectionists was going to blow them all up, and so they had to leave. Interesting note about these interior helicopter scenes where the flare goes off. All of the helicopters that are shown in this sequence, when you're inside the helicopter with the men, that's not a helicopter on the ground being rocked. We actually went up into the air with all the sequence involving the men in the helicopters. I, in fact, went on all of it myself. And if we set off a flare or did this kind of nutty stuff, we were doing it with usually a petrified Filipino pilot, and we were actually in the helicopter up in the air. It was pretty scary, and especially, the most dangerous part of a helicopter is the tail rotor. And here we are dollying with our tracks and cameramen back and forth. I mean, had we nicked somebody with the tail rotor, it would have been curtains. I want to commend and acknowledge here that I had seen a documentary called A Face of War by great filmmaker Eugene Jones, which I found very inspiring, which I based so much of my inspiration from the extraordinary work of that documentary. I mean, it was one of the things that made me want to make Apocalypse Now. This, by the way, is my nephew administering water to the wounded soldier. That's Mark Coppola. He's known as the only Mark Coppola in New York, who's a very well-loved disc jockey there. Some of you will know him. There's so many memories in this. My family, of course, my children were there during Apocalypse Now. My wife Eleanor was shooting a documentary, which of course came out as Hearts of Darkness there. And we began to become very interested during the shooting in this colored smoke. The military uses colored smoke to, of course, mark certain areas and give landing areas for helicopters. But we started to be like these psychedelic soldiers ourselves and say, "Wow, look at that yellow smoke! Look at that blue smoke!" And little by little, the colored smoke began to become a kind of leitmotif of this movie, as you'll see developing up the river. These are terrible scenes. The sapper who throws the grenade and then blows up the helicopter, and the pilot, who was played by Dick White, who goes after them. I'm, by the way, responsible for that explosion that happened in that small used helicopter. I told the effects guy to make it bigger than they were making it. And I said, Dick White, he's a great pilot. He'll be fine. And, of course, they set it off, as you see, and it really shocked Dick. And for a second, the helicopter was a little bit out of control. I always feel very guilty about that. But I am very, very, very grateful, and I am thankful. I can't tell you how thankful that we made this film, doing some of the most dangerous things on Earth with boats, helicopters, every form of dangerous equipment. And we did not lose one life.
Surf or fight. That's clear. Now get going. I'll cover for him. That's where the Report for Lance.
I remember this day very well because I must confess to you that I was pretty distraught during the shooting of all this helicopter battle. It was clearly taking much longer than we had anticipated. But on this day, I remember was a breaking point with me. I mean, a good luck breaking point, because up till this point, I mean, I cannot tell you how down in the dumps I was. That I was in this little hot kind of a little cage almost that I used to go in. Oh, by the way, we had to build a special boat that could be lifted by a helicopter, because the type of military helicopter that would lift this boat was a Chinook, and the Department of Defense would not give us a Chinook. So a regular UE helicopter, which these Bell helicopters are, couldn't lift the boat, and so we had to have a light boat to be able to lift it up. There was always a scene in which, again, to express this ambiguous morality, I mean, he steps out of the plane and says, bomb the tree line back another 50 yards, and yet when a Vietnamese woman approaches him with a wounded baby, Kilgore steps forward and takes the baby tenderly and gives it to a medic and says, I want this baby airlifted to a hospital immediately, despite the fact in a moment he'll, kill these people or bring down a rain of fire on people's heads. Here I was financing this picture. I was liable for the cost of it. This helicopter battle was going on forever, and nothing was going my way. And we had this huge scene of a napalm drop, which had taken days to prepare, and we only were going to have 2 shots at it. It was done with a half a mile of pipe that was filled with gasoline, and then they set it off. And the scene you're seeing now with the jets coming was take 1, and I only could do take 2 to send the jets back and fill the pipe with the gasoline. And I was terrified that if some kid wandered into the jungle, even though we had posted it with signs that what if some kid along that half a mile happened to be there. I can't tell you how worried I was. And in this scene that we're watching, you see it all happening, all of this action, helicopters flying back and forth. Incidentally, this is the scene where we had 5 cameras going, one of which was used in the trash can to make the opening. And here the jets came, then they had to go from half an hour before to get there. And here it's all happening, and they dropped the napalm, and it all went perfectly. And at that moment, I had the first hope that maybe this was not going to be the film that just totally finished me in every sense. And in fact, we never did take 2. That was take 1.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know one time we had a hail bomb?
Of course, this is another one of John Milius's great lines. I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Big body. Smell. You know that gasoline smell? A whole hill. Smells like victory. Someday this war's gonna end. Lance! The wind!
By now you see that we're getting very hung up on these colored smoke grenades, and the movie is beginning to take a very odd, surreal path, which was to really plague me throughout the rest of the shooting, because I knew that the ending of the original script, which was a relatively conventional kind of war film ending, was not going to be a fitting ending for the way I was making the movie, that it was becoming a very surreal movie, and a kind of normal, John Wayne ending where they battle the bad guys wasn't going to work. And in a sense, I was painting myself in a corner, and I knew it. Without my colleagues, without Vittorio Storaro and Dean Tavaleris, I don't know if I would have made it.
You sure? Yeah! Get the fuck out of here! Just a fucking napalm! Just wait 20 minutes!
By the way, Bobby Duvall there is imitating me, because whenever I would lose my temper, I would chuck my radio. Motorola radios would cost, $2,600, and every time I chucked one, it was, serious. So there was a guy assigned to try to get the radio out of my hand before I did it. And Bobby Duvall, in that scene where he chucks the megaphone, is making fun of me, something he, of course, likes to do. That sequence of the stealing of the surfboard and a little bit of comedy was not in the original Apocalypse Now, and it was one of many, many sequences that, including the entrance of the Colonel, Bobby Duvall's entrance, was different in the first version, where we had a mentality of let's not dawdle, let's get right into it. Don't take the time to introduce the colonel with his own helicopter landing, or let's not fool around with this surfboard being stolen, a little Marx Brothers moment, and it was put back into Apocalypse Now Redux, which is the version we're watching now.
Trouble is, I'd been back there, and I knew that it just didn't exist anymore.
Put it down.
The script was originally titled, I remember, when John Milius first talked about it, I remember he called it The Psychedelic Soldier. And I think what had happened is in those days, a lot of John's friends, guys who had been surfers, were coming back from the Vietnamese War telling stories of basically what was going on there and the use of drugs, of grass, of a kind of new kind of war with a almost surreal sensibility, drug-induced sensibility. Of course, that was part of the inspiration of the style of this movie, and an attempt to hold some of these absurdities, surfing in Vietnam, and this type of strange behavior, destroying a village so you could go surfing, all seems possible because of a kind of a heightened hallucinogenic sensibility.
Hey, Chief. Yeah. Here comes that colonel guy.
The sequence of the colonel sending helicopters around with this announcement, "Give back the board," also was cut out of the first version. And again, in the Redux version, I decided that, well, it was possible to have some of these more comedy moments. In the first version, again, as I said, we were very concerned with making it a more conventional war film because we were terrified that the audiences and the distributors in particular were going to reject it as too strange a film, too long. And so some of these moments were taken out, but the whole subplot of Willard stealing his surfboard and taking it with them throughout the rest of the trip, and of course the colonel sending his helicopters, probably with recordings, asking to give back his board, all that was added back. The famous bandage. Why is he wearing a bandage? It's because in one of the early sequences, Martin really fell on his gun and cut himself. And whereas I suppose I could have covered it up with makeup, the kind of director I was at the time, maybe still am, in terms of being available. As I said, well, if he fell on his gun, he really fell on his gun, what would they do? And they said, well, they'd give him a bandage. I said, okay, well, let's give him a bandage, and so that's why he has a bandage. On one hand, it sort of sticks out. On the other hand, it's what would have really happened if a guy fell on his gun. So, who's to know what's right and what's wrong?
Classified, Chief, I can't tell you.
When I'm making a film, I have this saying I often say, I call it match upwards. What I mean is that in movies, when you shoot so many scenes, so many different times, you sort of are concerned with matching what you did to what you had done. And very often you may have done something so that something wonderful happens that's really good, but you kind of can't use it because it doesn't match with what you did before. And I've always believed, the hell with that. I'm just going to match upwards. I'm going to take the best thing, and if it doesn't match, well, so be it, or I'll try to go back and make it match. And again, to try to always be very available to whatever happens, like the bandage, like the falling on the gun. And try to constantly let the movie partly make itself. Let the actors create their own characters out of what's really happening.
Call me what, sir?
Chef, did you like mangoes and stuff?
No, sir. I'm a real chef. I'm a saucier.
Saucier.
Yes, sir. See, I come from New Orleans.
This sequence in which they leave the boat to go into the jungle to find mangoes, because of course Chef is a chef, and he knows there are mangoes there, and he thought he would get off the boat and go collect them. I remember this extraordinary tree being there in the Philippines. I just thought that was the most amazing looking tree, and of course by now Victorio was beginning to exercise his extraordinary interest in the philosophy and spirituality of color, and this was going to be a blue sequence, as you see, and as also enhanced by the blue bucket.
I joined the Navy.
Now, the tiger. Well, there was a tiger. He was a real tiger, and the trainer called him Gambi. I remember very, very vividly that we were shooting in a place very far away from the original Manila plane station, and on the occasion when many of the Italian crew had invited their wives to come from Rome, these Italian ladies all in their lovely dresses to visit their husbands, when they got on the plane that was going to take them to our location, a trainer came on to the plane with a tiger on a leash, and of course these ladies were hysterical. The pilots were absolutely refusing to fly the plane with a tiger in it. In fact, they had locked the door, and they had a step ladder so they would climb into the cockpit through the side window because they didn't want to be anywhere near where this tiger was. And in fact, Freddie Forrest didn't want to be anywhere near where this tiger was. And this tiger was a very uncontrollable thing. And I remember that in the sequence, we of course had the tiger there, and a very brave stuntman named Terry Leonard, a big guy, actually was sort of baiting the tiger with a squealing pig he was holding in his hands. And the idea is he would hold this pig out to entice the tiger. And when the tiger made a lunge for the pig, Terry would throw the pig in a box so that the tiger wouldn't eat the pig. Freddie was very afraid of this tiger, and I kept saying, Freddie, go closer to the tiger. And he said, I'm not going, man, I'm not going closer. I said, Freddie, get closer to the tiger, it's right there. Well, he was so afraid of this tiger, and in one of the takes, I swear, I think the tiger got the pig before Terry was able to get in the box and ran off with it, and we had to spend hours trying to find this tiger. Well, Freddie was very frightened of this tiger, and this is the scene where he used my trying to help him get into his character. And I said, Freddie, whenever you don't know who you are, just say, man, I'm not getting off the boat. I'm not here. I'm not really here. And that was the basis of his character. I remember in this scene, Freddie, his hysteria about the tiger is not acting. I didn't get out of the 8th grade for this. Well, Freddie had found his character thanks to the cooperation of Gambi the tiger. I am told, I hate to say this, but I am told that sometime later, and I don't know if this is true, but Gambi the tiger did in fact kill someone and had to be put to death. You know, movie people are crazy. They do things that are extremely dangerous. Maybe Freddie was more correct in not wanting to step closer to the tiger. I, of course, am very trusting, and I kept saying, get close to the tiger, get close to the tiger. But, you know, maybe Gambi the tiger wasn't the right tiger to get closer to. I've often thought that a really young director has some advantages over an older director. And, you know, a young director has enthusiasm. Certainly an older director can have enthusiasm. But the young director has something the older director doesn't have. The younger director has basically stupidity. I mean, which is to say that he will attempt things that are so stupid, that are so obviously impossible to do. And when I think of this movie and what we were trying to do with the money we actually had, and to sign myself on the line as I did, I mean, what was I thinking? You know, there I was in a foreign country with a script that was not really finished because the style I was making it in clearly was not leading to the ending I had. And believe me, endings are the most important parts of movies. With helicopters and Air Force and 5 languages, I mean, what possibly could I have been thinking? And, you know, older directors don't have that lack of knowledge, or of, they have a kind of wisdom, which is also very strong. But, you know, the young filmmaker has this wonderful lack of intelligence when it comes to what's possible and what's not possible. And that enables him sometimes to do things that are really impossible.
Today was really a new one. Almost got eaten alive by a fucking tiger. Really unfucking believable, you know? We're taking this guy, Captain Willard, up the river, but he hasn't told us yet where we're taking him. Come on, baby, let the good time. Thought you might have heard by now from Elwood. I'll be coming home.
October 1967. On special assignment, Khantum Province 2 Corps. Kurt staged Operation Archangel with combined local forces. Rated a major success. He received no official clearance. He just started up and did it. What balls. They were going to nail his ass to the floorboards for that one. But after the press got a hold of it, they promoted him to full colonel instead.
This is an interesting story, the next sequence that's about to happen. We had a scene coming up in which there's a big Army recreation base where they would do those kinds of shows that you always hear about, you know, the kinds of shows that Bob Hope would visit, or the Playboy Bunnies or Raquel Welch would go visit. And there was a sequence in the script which was called How Fat. Of course, John's joke was it was spelled Hauphat, making the pun how fat, meaning how fat were the Americans.
Expecting us this time?
John's point was clear, that the American didn't just go to do war with their equipment. They brought their USO shows, and they brought all sorts of other amenities with them. And we had built the set for How Fat in sort of inland. In other words, we built it to be shot in the daytime, and it wasn't actually on the water. And it was an enormous set, big, expensive set. And I remember standing there looking at it with Dean Tavalaris and saying, Dean, we built the set wrong. He says, what do you mean? I said, well, I think it should be night, and it should be right on the water. And he said, well, this set cost whatever it was, and, that's not going to change. And so we left, and I thought about it. I said, God, I really wish I had understood better, so I wouldn't have built it this way. And the next thing we knew, there was an unbelievable typhoon. This typhoon was extraordinary. I was in a helicopter. I saw ocean liners being washed up onto the shore. And, it was an enormous, and the news were all full of this incredible typhoon that has wreaked havoc in the Philippines and destroyed many of the sets of Apocalypse Now, including the set of How Fat. And I'll talk more about this typhoon, but the point is that the set that I had just realized we built in the wrong way, in the wrong place, and should be shot at night, was now destroyed. I tried to keep shooting. I remember I was shooting right in the middle of the typhoon, and I just wouldn't, give up. When it was all said and done, the set had been destroyed. And so when we did rebuild it, after we got some insurance money, you never get as much insurance. It's like life. In the end, the insurance never covers what ultimately really happened to you. But we did lose that set, and we were able to build it again. And when we built it again, we built it differently. And we built it the way you see it now.
Hey, listen, Captain. On the house. No hard feelings, huh?
I'm not sure where the inspiration to hire Bill Graham, the great rock impresario, to be the MC of the show. Most probably it was Fred Roos who comes up with these kinds of ideas, but Bill Graham actually was a friend of mine, and he always was, an actor and loved acting. And so I talked him into coming with me to the Philippines. He was there during the typhoon, and he played this part. We shot it at night, and you'll see there's the late, great Bill Graham. Wonderful person, brilliant guy, and a wonderful actor.
I said, how you doing out there? What is happening to all of you out there? Who works so goddamn
Well, we had quite a bit of extras there, which were not easy to find, American GI extras. We were in the Philippines, so to find American types, you had to go to the various embassies and maybe some naval ships that were in to try to find the fellas to do this. The three playmates came from the U.S., Colleen Camp, Linda Carpenter, and the Playmate of the Year, Cindy Wood. All of these girls had been playmates, maybe Colleen not, maybe Colleen wasn't. An interesting side note is that the three playmates were cast before the typhoon, and as I recall, Colleen was a replacement. One of the original girls was Linda Carter, who then got the part to be in Wonder Woman, and so she didn't come back, and Colleen came back in her place. It wasn't hard to get all these fellas worked up by this show. I mean, in a sense, so much of what our experience was there was like the fellas in Vietnam. So when we had this big show and these beautiful girls dropping out of the sky, it was very, very easy to get the crowd to be enthusiastic. Of course, the idea was that they were going to get so enthusiastic that they would get out of hand. And ultimately, that's what happened, albeit staged. An interesting notion was how Vittorio dealt with the need to light this pitch black part of the river. He created these rafts that had these array of lights that actually floated there and lit the scene in that way artificially. I was always curious of what Vietnamese people, or the locals, so to speak, might have thought separated from a spectacle like this by cyclone fences, and couldn't resist a shot of the real people who were witnessing what was going on from behind the fence, as it were.
You fucking dead! Take it off! Take it off! Hey, lover, you want us to come over? I sure do! Send my simple!
So the girls provoked the boys, and of course they're thrilled to to actually have girls that they had seen in this magazine be there, and, you know, of course, would love to have signatures and what have you. And ultimately, I think a couple of them, as you see, jump across the moat that was meant to separate the girls from the boys. And, well, the Bill Graham character has seen this happen many times, and he starts the helicopter going because something like this could easily get out of control. I think he conveniently had a smoke grenade in his pocket to try to prepare for their hasty retreat. And again, it was just so surreal. I mean, it was surreal to be there in the situation I was in, and we were really in the middle of the jungle on this. We had built the set on this river in the blackness after this moment of revelation when I decided the first set had been built in the wrong place. Again, the colored smoke, the visual motif of the surreal. And, you know, I have no idea how I thought of doing this ending, the thing with the helicopter going up and the guys trying to hang on to it. And ultimately our stuntmen did this extraordinary work actually dangling from the helicopter. And then we're night, making it all the more perilous. And, you know, the helicopter whipping up the smoke. It was hard to resist to just take the film into a surrealistic moment at this point in reflection.
Charlie didn't get much USO. He was dug in too deep or moving too fast.
And of course, Willard with his bottle of cognac hidden in a magazine, just quietly drinking.
He had only two ways home: death or victory.
This is, in fact, what the set looked like the next day, and so we just took advantage of filming what was really there for the boat to be leaving.
No wonder Kurtz put a weed up Command's ass.
The only real structural change in Apocalypse Now Redux as opposed to the classical version is that we use the water skiing scene when Lance the Surfer water skis in a slightly different place because the requirements were different. Adding back the scene that had been deleted where Chef tells the story about the man who was so in love with his Playboy centerfold, and ultimately the other soldier defaced it with pinholes in the picture until finally the guy couldn't take it anymore and blew him away, involved a restructuring that we did, which is a difference between the classical version and the Redux version, in that those sequences are a different structural order entirely.
And when them cocky goop asshole lieutenants and shit, and one day the goop took his magazine from him and wouldn't give it back to him. He said, "Give me my magazine back." Goop said, "You shot up. I how you call my shot."
Without a doubt, the overriding anxiety I had, aside from the daily overruns and the fact that the film was taking longer than it was supposed to happen, but the overriding anxiety I had was that I did not know how to end the film. I did not know what the last scenes should be. In the original John Milius script, pretty much what happens is Willard gets there and finds Colonel Kurtz, who is fit and a kind of renegade soldier who's bitten into the dark side, and ultimately there were reports of Kurtz actually firing at his own helicopters, and I think the last scene of the script was supposed to be a big attack of North Vietnamese regulars that attack, and Kurtz takes his motley group of Montagnards and men and is going to meet them in this final battle, and I think in the original script Willard joins him, and I think in one of the last scenes there are some American helicopters and Willard is firing at them, and I like that part, but I couldn't understand how I could do a great big movie battle scene with the NVA and what have you, and I knew that the way I was making the film, I had to do something totally different, something as strange as some of the scenes had been on the way up the river. And as I went further and further up the river, further into the story, further and further into my own personal adventure or misadventure, I began to think of possibly what could I do? How could I get myself out of this?
Now here's another blast from the past going out to Big Sam, who's all alone in the mantle room out there with the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, and dedicated by the fire team at Odd Cage to their groovy CO friend, the Head. The Rolling Stones, satisfaction.
Watch out, please! Get down, Bubba! Get down, Bubba!
And Larry Fishburne, he had several birthdays on this thing, so maybe he was 15 now. And I know that Willard is thinking, what I was thinking, which is, how can I make sense out of all of this? And at these different points in the story, he retreats into the dossier and learns more of the pieces of Colonel Kurtz that is drawing him upward into the river, into the heart of darkness. When we considered possibility adding the scenes back for Redux, we did add back more of the dossier scenes, giving more information on Kurtz with the solo flute that I spoke of. And so one of the differences, as we see, there are additional dossier scenes.
As long as cold beer, hot food, rock and roll, and all the other amenities remain the expected norm,
Whenever I hear the sound of the flute, I always see the face of my father. Willard is a kind of a witness to everything. He's a passive character. He's not doing this kind of New York acting made so famous by Bobby De Niro and Joe Pesci and Harvey and Marty, ultimately. Willard is more passive. He's the witness to this type of stuff, and I think that was what I expressed about wanting a more passive actor in the role, who you could just look at and regard his face and imagine what he was thinking of. All these antics were reported as really having happened, riverboats playing chicken with each other and throwing smoke grenades at each other so that actually fires were set. But a strange transformation is happening because of every opportunity to show it, the canopy catching on fire. It's as though the river that they're on is a river into the past. It's going back into time, and they're becoming more and more primitive, replacing the hole in the canopy of the boat with palms and material from the jungle. It's like they're becoming less this modern, sophisticated, mechanized army and more this primitive group of men going back into time.
Late summer, autumn, 1968. Kurtz's patrols in the highlands coming under frequent ambush. The camp started falling apart. November. Kurtz orders assassination of 3 Vietnamese men and 1 woman. 2 of the men were colonels in the South Vietnamese army. Enemy activity in his old sector dropped off to nothing. Guess he must have hit the right 4 people.
He joined the Special Forces. And after that, his,
The army tried one last time to bring him back into the fold.
methods
And if he pulled over, it all would have been forgotten.
and sound.
But he kept going,
Now he's crossed into Cambodia.
and he kept winning it his way.
Montagnard army of his who
And they called me in.
a man like a god and follow every order, however ridiculous.
They lost him.
This whole question is of morality. I mean, how can you charge an officer, say, with murder? Or how can you reprimand soldiers who have been trained to basically mistreat people, to kill them? How can you charge them on issues that are moral issues? Because you're so outside of morality. And again, it was that dilemma of charging someone with murder in context to a war that was basically just murdering lots of people, or the great line that I heard from John Milius, which we say in the film, they won't let the boys write the word fuck on their airplanes, and yet they teach them to drop fire into people's homes. How can a civilized person hold that in your head? How can you, on one hand, make a major expenditure of money and effort and modern resources to basically kill and destroy and remove forests, and yet at the same time argue some simple point of morality? It gives you a headache to even think about it. That was at the heart of Apocalypse Now. That's really what Apocalypse Now was about. And I never thought of Apocalypse particularly as an anti-war film, although certainly when you show people being massacred and being plundered in the way that you do, one assumes that creates an anti-war attitude.
I'll cut you and the crew loose.
Recently, I gave permission for the film Jarhead to use the sequence of the Ride of the Valkyrie from Apocalypse Now. It was a request from Walter Murch and from the film's director, Sam Mendes. I felt loath to turn down a colleague such as Walter and certainly a fellow director such as Sam Mendes. They would show the helicopter sequence of Apocalypse Now to get the young soldiers all stoked up to send them off to war, and they asked the permission to show the sequence, and I said, well, God, I think Apocalypse Now was meant to be more than that, and I would feel badly if it comes off as just being kind of a film that's used as pornography for grunts, as the phrase in this book is. And the director assured me that that's not how it would come off, and said he would show it to me, and if I felt it was, portraying apocalypse on this one note as just something to stoke your worst instincts towards violence, that he would do something about it. But, I wonder if I'm really going to have the opportunity to or should I even bother to try to moderate that? I mean, it's clear that if you want to make a really anti-war film, you have to be far, far from the battlefield, because if you show battle, you're in a sense exciting people, even though it's horrible, and people are drawn to watching violence in movies because somehow it's a vantage point. They can watch the violence and have all the thrills of it and not be in danger, not be hurt. I guess that's why it's appealing. And if you want to make a film that's anti-war, it has to be a film about love, and it can't be near a battlefield. It has to be far from the battlefield, where the real decisions are made as to whether there's war or not.
I am beyond their timid.
By now, as the boat is journeying back in time, there are these various vestiges on the outer limit of the savage of our mechanization, our helicopters and our big planes, basically being reclaimed by the jungle. Now, this sequence was actually shot during the typhoon. I was so determined not to give up that although this set was totally destroyed, I went with a group of our guys, and I remember people in different jobs, like the stillman, Josh Wiener, and other people, and we just kind of dug in the mud, and the rain never stopped. And we put this set together, and you wouldn't be able to make rain on an area that big, so this was the rain. And, I've always loved to shoot in weather, and whenever it rains or snows or everyone's ready to go home, I say, no, let's shoot. And I was just that way until it was so clear that everything was so destroyed that I finally had to give up. But I shot this sequence during the typhoon and took advantage of the very surreal notion of this, what was a medevac camp that was so out of the way and cut off by the typhoon that there was really no longer any communication between it and the rest of the forces. The sequence was added back for Apocalypse Now Redux. In fact, it was never entirely shot. The idea that I was working on is that, as per the John Milius script, the captain came, look at this, I mean, it's raining everywhere you see. This was clearly, we didn't make this rain. But the idea of the scene was that the captain was going to come to this outpost that had been, devastated by the typhoon, and would come into view of the Playboy helicopter, which was just stuck there. And he realized that the Playboy helicopter had, run out of gas, and they must be there somewhere, which is to say those girls, as well as Bill Graham. And it was always a, questionable moral scene, but then again, the whole film was about questionable morals, and the idea was that in the script that Willard sort of trades Bill Graham for sort of encounter with those girls for his men in return for a couple of barrels of fuel. In the mood we were in when we were doing Redux, even though we hadn't shot the entire scene, we hadn't shot the final scene with Bill Graham. In fact, that is supposedly Bill Graham in the tent. Maybe it was, now I don't remember. But I made the decision to go for it and to try to put the sequence together as best I could with the footage I had. That's so funny, it's a one each, Buffalo, U.S. Army. But yeah, here's the helicopter. It means that all those girls and Bill Graham are still there, and the captain has traded some fuel for a chance to be closer to these girls. And so I had a chance to make 3 vignettes, and I only shot 2 of them because things got so crazy at that point with the typhoon and what was going on that we just basically stopped production and went home while we rebuilt everything. But this was me while I was still in the, where typhoon, let's shoot in the typhoon. I'm not stopping for anything. I felt in the original scope of Apocalypse Now that this kind of absurd humor was in keeping with things like the helicopter battle or some of the other absurdities, the tiger. And so I kind of went for it. And again, the script was like that. It had the sequence of finding the girls from the USO show or from the show further up the river, stranded because the helicopter had run out of fuel.
Captain, get in a firefight and run out of fuel. I want you to tell me how she was.
Albert Hall was such an interesting presence on the boat. He was what the character in the story was. He was his boat. He was the custodian of the boat. He was looking out for everyone's safety. And Albert always had a very high moral point of view. He viewed things in his own way. And he was very patient, but at one point I seemed to recall him looking at me admonishingly, as though, I was the one who had everyone on this journey, trying to discover this movie that I wasn't exactly sure of in terms of where it was going. So it's about to now ensue our 3 vignettes, and I think I only shot 2 of them, and they were very much based out of the lives of the girls. I remember, we at this point we didn't have real scenes for the scenes the way I chose to do them, and so I spent time. I remember with Colleen, and she told me lots of stories about how she had worked at Busch Gardens. She was the bird girl of Busch Gardens, and so I basically developed a scene out of her real story. Cindy Wood had told me very, very touching stories about what she felt in the business of being a pinup and what have you. And I began to see the parallel between, how we exploit the young boys by sending them off to this obscenity Cold War, and we take our young girls and we point them to another form of obscenity. It's really the same exploitation of youth, by people much older who ought to be their protectors. But I worked with them, in that fashion that we do, and tried to get them to confess their feelings about their lives, and I tried to orchestrate these strange scenes between these beautiful young people, in this case Sam Bottoms, and this character Chef, who just couldn't believe that he actually was in the same space as the girl he always loved so much in the centerfold, and even to the extent of trying to get her to wear the wig so she'd look like she did in the picture. It's like that famous joke about the guy who is washed up on the island with Raquel Welch. Men are so funny about women. It's as much about just the idea that they're with them than it is about the great joy of being with them. The scene with Willard was with the third playmate, and that was meant to be a tarot reading scene in which the third playmate reads his fortune and uses so many of the symbols of the tarot deck, which would, like the hanged man and the this and the skulls and that. And in telling the fortune, she was going to basically lay out what was to be the last third of the movie. But as I said, I never shot that scene. And, at this point, I was in a situation where I was starting to make the movie just too long, because I was starting to love working on it, and all of these extraordinary ideas which were being suggested from the research I was doing, that supposedly I was trying to write the ending of the script, but I kept reading more information, hunting for any clue. And I was also reading Heart of Darkness, so I was seeing new scenes in Heart of Darkness and thinking of ways to set that in modern context. I remember I wrote a letter or a phone call to Terry Malick, who I've always thought was such a brilliant guy, but he's hilariously funny. And he was going to come to the Philippines and play the character out of the Conrad, who was the rivet salesman. I was going to do a rivet salesman sequence. And my own sister Tally, I was going to have her come and be one of the donut dollies, and I started to just overproduce ideas for scenes, which of course was very disconcerting to everyone concerned on the practical side of this, because it was clear I wasn't planning to wrap this up. And if anything, I was stalling because I still didn't have an ending. I kept inventing new scenes, some of which were pretty good. It would have been pretty good, in a sense, just as some of these sequences that we're watching, which were definitely being built out of the characters who were there, the people who were there, the actual girls telling me about their stories, and just kind of, trying to do kind of absurd comedy in the midst of this grotesque war. I mean, one could say that I was right to cut the sequence out, and then yet in the mood that I was in for doing Redux, I said, well, this was all very interesting, and made the film all the more bizarre. And at this point, the more interesting, more bizarre, the more unusual it became, the better. When I saw the original version of Apocalypse Now, this was in 2000, and I thought, my God, this is so tame. I thought Apocalypse Now was very unusual. This isn't so unusual at all, and I was very motivated to go into the material and make it be as crazy as the film I had shot. I felt there was something touching about these beautiful kids, and in their stories of how each of them had been exploited, and the idea of how we, rather than protect and uplift and educate young people, we tend to drag them down. Strange.
Hell, I didn't know it was a Jerry. Didn't know you never got no good. Shut her, fuck up. Sure, sorry about that. If I'd have known, I'd take you to New Orleans. Man, fuck you. Introduce you to Coos, brother. Lay off, Jeff. Jerry boy, da 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 da. The fucking dog. Come on down, New Orleans, brother.
So now the guys are getting on each other's nerves. You know, Lance is getting into his face paint, you know, with a little too much psychedelic emphasis, and Chef is cooking his spam on the diesel engine of the boat, which I understand they really did. And there's the chief trying to hold everyone together like really the mother of the ship.
Ben, what's with all the green paint? Camouflage. How's that? So they can't see you. They're everywhere, Chief. Uh-huh. I want you to stay awake up there, man. We got a job to do.
I knew that the character of Kurtz was going to be very, very, very strange. If anything, he was going to have to be shown in razor slices. In other words, for him to have the mystery that we were building up to, that we were not going to ever be able to show much of him.
What's up, Chief?
Now, the scene you're about to see is, of course, inspired by the My Lai massacre that had become so notorious in the news. Something that we embarrassingly have become more familiar with, the idea that the American soldier, the wonderful American soldier that we love from World War II, could be as sadistic and as cruel and as trigger-happy as anyone else's soldiers. And it was Walter Murch on the break back in America after the typhoon told me that he felt that the film needed a scene that was more like the My Lai massacre. And as I said, I was always happy to invent a new scene, anything to keep me from dealing with my real problem, which was the ending. And I thought very much what Walter suggested was right. And I don't remember exactly whether he came up with the thought of the little dog or if that came from working out the scene. But I felt it was a wonderful idea of his because it gave the movie not only a moment of suspense, but also caught that My Lai sense that really, you know, we were there with our guns loaded and it was very easy for innocent people. You see Lawrence Fishburne there. We affectionately called him the Fish in those days when he was a kid, but he's all stoked up and ready to be dangerous. And Chef is, of course, unglued as usual. And this whole thing has just the markings of tragedy about to happen.
Rice, here's rice. What's in that vegetable basket? Don't talk. Get out of here. Come on. Get over here. Yeah, check that vegetable basket. All right. Shut up, Slow. There ain't nothing in here. What's in the boxes? Look in the tin can. Nothing. That rusty can. Just fucking rice, and that's all. There ain't nothing on it. Yellow can. Check the yellow can. She was sitting on it. What's in it?
I guess this is how it happens, you know. I mean, people are keyed up. Someone makes a move to the left or to the right. Today, the news is that the police shot with 5 shots to the head a suicide bomber who turned out not to be a suicide bomber. So, you know, who's to blame? I mean, if people are frightened, if they don't know when they're likely to be attacked, then they unleash it. It's just the Oresteia all over again. You can't keep trading violence with violence. It just will bring about this. It'll bring about this heartbreak.
The fucking puppy. The fucking puppy. Give me that dog. Give me that. No, you're not gonna get it. No, give me the fucking dog, you asshole.
Doesn't look it, but we were actually not cruel to the dog. I mean, Sam was extremely savvy with the animals, and he actually was quite fond of that dog, and that's how it became like a fixture on the boat and in the story for the next section of the film. Again, the moral dilemma, you know, technically by the rules of the game, if the woman in question is still alive, they're obligated to take her to medical help, and of course, you know, Willard's mission is to continue going on, and so again, the moral issue is dealt with again. He kills her in cold blood rather than to bring her back, assuming she would have died anyway. But in the duel with the chief, of course, the chief insisted on their inspecting the sampan. So again, the blame goes back and forth. Ultimately, who has the blame? We all have the blame. From this moment on, when really you see blood shed so directly, both by the crew of the boat and by Willard in the case of the girl, that once life is taken, the path is very, very different. At this point, I began to realize that this journey up the river was really a journey through time, and that I was moving to the past. And at first it was going to be in a matter of years, and then tens of years, taking me to the kind of Indochina period into the 50s when the French had fought in Vietnam. And then after that, it would be going back into decades and centuries, and then ultimately thousands of years into the prehistory of human beings. It felt that way.
We're never going to look at me the same way again. But I felt like I knew one or two things about Kurtz that weren't in the dossier.
Also, I was learning from working on the film what the style was, and after that strange USO show, I'll call it, where the Playboy Bunnies came, I was beginning to realize that the style was ever more surreal, and in a sense, this sequence that we're now approaching, the Do Lung Bridge, was kind of seen through Lance's eyes. And
Hey, you know that last tab of acid I was saving? Yeah.
Lance has just confessed that he's dropped some acid. And the entire sequence that's about to happen is shot as though that were the case, as though the entire film crew had it. And in truth, I had never experienced LSD, and certainly this wasn't influenced by that. But I was conscious of showing it through Lance's eyes and also through mythical eyes. I mean, this was clearly the inferno of Dante, and the lost souls were crying to get out, and that we were reaching a point where we were at the limit of civilization. It's almost as though, lasciate speranza chi voi entrate, abandon hope if you come to this bridge. Even the situation of the bridge was absurd. I mean, they would build the bridge and the enemy would blow it up, and then they'd build it again so they could say the bridge was working.
Happy this makes me, sir. Why? Now I can get out of here, if I can find a way.
Of course, Willard gets his last dossier. In a funny way, Willard was like myself. We were shooting these various strange episodes, and every so often I was going back to this pouch, this dossier, which was the script, and trying to figure out ultimately, okay, what is my mission? What's going to happen as the end? Knowing that as I made the film stranger and explored this phantasmagoric imagery, that the ending that I had wasn't going to work. And I was just terrified. Every night after work, I would go home and I would work on the script. I must have written 500 endings for this movie. I recall this sequence and talking to my father and saying to him, let the music almost sound like the hurdy-gurdy of a carnival. I remember my family was there in the Philippines during this movie, and I remember my boy Gio. He was, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14, and he wanted to be an extra in the sequence, and he was dressed up in his army fatigues, this little skinny kid in one of those foxholes. I never forget his face all blackened with war paint, but he stayed up through the night. These sequences obviously were shot through the night. And just at every level, you found madness. In this sequence, he jumps in the foxhole, and these people living down there. And, of course, Willard is going to try to find who is the commanding officer. There was a young, talented guitarist named Randy Henson who had been performing a Jimi Hendrix show in which he got done up as Jimi Hendrix and would play the guitar, and it was astounding, his show. I always admired Randy Henson, and his contribution to Apocalypse Now is quite significant. He played those Jimi Hendrix guitar lines that just come out, and it's another element of orchestration because it's as though you orchestrated for helicopter engine and motorboat engine and wind and Jimi Hendrix guitar. Those are all the voices of the movie. Now a sequence that was conceived and written by John Milius, the story of Roach, who was shooting at NBA regulars out there. They literally could talk to each other. That's a tradition from warfare, I don't know how long, but on the ultimate ends of the lines, the soldiers from one side could shout over to the soldiers on the other side and taunt each other, which is what's happening here. Of course, Lance is so spaced out with his little puppy in his vest that he's just like looking at the pretty lights, and I guess that was one aspect of Vietnam why it was a psychedelic war, because there were drugs, And under the influence of those drugs, they would conceivably forget their own safety, just kind of be hypnotized by the beautiful lights and colors. And of course, we were trying to express that. And of course, the closer you got to the actual fighting and to the dangerous part, the more and more black soldiers there were, so that it began to be a kind of cultural shift going on in this sequence, as you can see. Very surreal sequence. Again, this was in the script of John Milius, and so, you know, in a way, this feeling I had that the story was getting more and more surreal was also in John's screenplay. It would do these excursions and take you into the surreal. And again, that's why I felt the type of ending we had was not going to work, or at least I didn't know how to do it. It's curious what I would have done had I ended it with an NBA battle, you know. But I don't know, a battle sequence, to have a great big battle at the end, just did not seem right to me. I couldn't accept that, and yet I couldn't come up with an alternative. I tried many versions, and I couldn't come up with any that would satisfy me. I was watching a movie the other day and had a scene very much like this, I must say. I wondered if they had seen this film. Well, probably they had.
Fucker. Hey, soldier. Do you know who's in command here?
Yeah.
I guess that was the point of the whole sequence. He was asking everyone along the way who was in command. One guy said, "Ain't you?" But the Roach had the answer.
Shit.
Well, at this point, we passed the demarcation line, and if they were going to go on, they were going to get into some pretty strange stuff. And Francis was going to get into some pretty strange stuff, and I knew it. I wasn't sure what that stuff was, but at this point, the style of the movie, as happens on a project, you start the movie day one, you start shooting, and then together you discover things that you find interesting, and then you say, oh yeah, let's do more of that, let's do more of that. And, you know, after 30 days, you've kind of evolved the style with the camera, with the look, with the details of the props, and as I say in this case, the smoke grenades, and you find your way as you go. I often think that for me, and perhaps for other people, that filmmaking is sort of like asking a question, and the making of the film and finishing the film is where you get the answer. Now, that's a terrifying thing to tell to a financier, you know, say, well, yeah, I want to make this movie. It's sort of like a question. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure that if I can make it, I'll find the answer. And that's why in my career, I've often found myself forced to be the financier, as in a way I was in Apocalypse Now, because how else could I find someone who's willing to go on a trip like that into a territory where you don't know the answer? Business doesn't operate that way. You don't make a product that you sort of are not sure that the public is going to buy. You make a product that you've either based on some other product that the public will buy, or that you've tested it. But in a movie or perhaps in a work of art, that's just not the case. Well, now we're on the other side of the Dolong Bridge, and I think if there was any reality to this story up till now, we've left it behind. And in my mind, we're now passing in time, and of course they're hanging on to some link with home. That last mail that was delivered before the bridge now is going to be distributed. I went to military school when I was a kid, and between being like 16 and 15, the mail just takes on an importance that I couldn't express how important when you got a letter. And very often I wouldn't get a letter, or get a letter once in a while from my family or from some kid at school, or once I even got a letter from a girl. I remember her name, Sally Lieberman. She sent me a letter, and I didn't even know her so well. And Sally Lieberman was beautiful. And in the letter, there were even some pistachio nuts. I can't tell you how I will never forget that letter that I got. And so imagine for these kids, after passing a nightmare like that, getting mail. This letter is a curious thing. It's been intercepted. It was the officer that was sent before Willard to do this dirty job to eliminate Colonel Kurtz, and the only word that they got, he didn't do it, but he sends a letter: sell the car, sell the kids, I'm never coming back. And that's what happens to people who venture there into the unknown jungle. And curiously, the other stuff comes wrapped in the paper with the Manson story, and we felt very much as though that was all connected. Freddie Forrest was very frightened of this scene because he was sure that, as he would put it, the creepy crawlers were going to come and get him, because he referred to the the Manson case. Well, now you see what's happening with the colored smoke. What started as marking a helicopter in that first helicopter battle now became a whole religious ritual, and we just couldn't resist. We'd look at one another and I'd say, Vittorio or Dean, should we get some colored smoke out? And of course, we never said no. I asked Larry Fishburne if he could ask his mother to please record the kind of a tape that a mom would send to her young son. His mom did that for us, and that is the tape in the tape recorder.
If this tape is any good, I will have Dad and the family send you a tape.
The concept here was to try to simulate the tracer bullets. One out of every 10 rounds of these machine guns would have a tracer so they could see where they were firing. And my thought was to not show the assailants whatsoever and just see the tracers. Tracers are hard to fake. And of course, we were not firing machine gun bullets, so our special effects team, Joe Lombardi and A.D. Flowers, had to come up with basically a simulated tracer effect and would be actually shooting them. Called them glorified Roman candles, but they were more devilish than that, and they actually shot them at us. We were all in the PBR. As the director, I was always on the PBR, and some of them came really close to our actors' heads, notably Larry Fishburne's head. Joe Lombardi and Larry Kavanaugh and A.D. Flowers, I mean, rest in peace, these guys. We will not see their like again, but they were so ingenious and so daring. And, I was always coming up with requests that were sort of impossible. And they say, well, let me think of it. Of course, A.D. Flowers had been back to the days of Godfather, the special effects man. I would say, well, gee, A.D., if I wanted to have a guy get shot in the eye through his eyeglasses, how would you do that, He says, well, you couldn't really do it because the glass or the plastic would, hurt the eye, and can't really imagine how to do that. I said, well, would you think about it? And he said, yeah, and of course he came back and had a solution. And he was here with us on this picture, along with the other fellas I mentioned.
Because that's our secret. Anyhow, do the right thing. Stay out of the way of the bullets.
Now the toll has taken, as of course always happens, the youngest and the dearest, and the young boy is killed. Really heartbreaking. Of course, our young actor was, making believe, but I could imagine it taking someone like the kid, like the young boy. And I realized at this point there was going to start to be a head count, and that I wasn't even sure. The script didn't even indicate how many people would bite the dust. It wasn't exactly worked out in the script. I was sort of just taking opportunities now as I saw them. I was really at this point beyond the pale, as they say, and inventing this as I was going along. Although, indeed, the script did have the death of Clean, and it did have the French plantation. I remember this shot very, very well. This B-52 tail, which the art department put there, was immense, and we literally sailed right under it. It was very thrilling to be there on that boat, for those who remember that moment together. Now, very much like Heart of Darkness, they're lost in the fog. We felt lost. I felt lost. All through this shooting, I did not know what the ending was going to be. And I knew that it was not going to be what I had on paper. And I would just go home at night and stay up all through the night. So I was pretty exhausted. And what made it worse is, this whole Italian crew, we were on this little island of a boat, and this entire Italian crew was smoking. And so I started smoking cigarettes for the first time. And I'm sure that began to wreak havoc with my system. I was smoking Balkan Zabroni cigarettes without filters. This part of the film, as we're moving through time, as we're passing through the fog, the boat goes back in time and goes further into primitive period. But in the Apocalypse Now Redux version, this is when we pass through the fog and into the docks of the French plantations, and these figures appear through the fog like ghosts. Well, now my feeling is we had gone into the 50s. It wasn't the period of Vietnam anymore. We had gone back to the French period. And indeed, John was quite correct. There were pockets of French nationals who had been in Vietnam for generations that tried to hold on to their land. This sequence was cut out of the picture. At the time, in 1979, we were trying to say, well, this is a big war film, and this very strange sequence coming at this point where they come upon this group of French who had stayed there. And it was one big chunk. I mean, if you lifted it out, you would pull out whatever it was, 15 minutes at one stroke. And I will tell you, frankly, that I always felt resentful of the French sequence, and I'll tell you why. Although in this, when we made this version, rather than go back and take the French sequence as it had been, the plantation sequence, Walter Murch decided to look at all the dailies once again and to treat it as though he was editing it for the first time. And so this cut of the French plantation is different, quite a bit different than the one that we finally lifted out of the film, which, as you can imagine, kept getting shorter and shorter as we kept trying to make the film shorter and shorter.
Cover the captain. Lands, cover the captain.
It's a rubber plantation, and, I wanted it to feel as though it was inhabited by ghosts, which, in a way, they are.
Ne tirez pas! Ne tirez pas! The French! The French! J'obéis mon homme! Chef! Pick up that weapon! Pick it up! Pick it up! Stand fast! Captain, nous sommes Americans! Nous ne voulons pas...
Of course, the chef, being a chef and coming from New Orleans, speaks a little bit of French. And then they are like a lost legion. The reason I was resentful of the French sequence is this. We had taken some time, and I had met with Fred Roos, and we had a list of French actors to play all these parts, and I recall meeting some of them. I can't remember where that was, but these were very important French actors, some names very well known. And when we put it all together, what this cast would be, and added it up, European actors sort of work in a different system, and even though they might only be working for a couple of weeks, they're used to being paid well. This list of names that we were going to bring from France were quite expensive, and we had one of those dire production meetings and decided that we couldn't afford them. By the way, this is Christian Marquand, who was an actor. He was in The Longest Day. He also was the director of the film Candy, a wonderful guy. So I said to everyone, I said, look, let's all agree. I will not have the cast that I've chosen. And let's not build an enormous set. And let's not, fly furniture in from God knows where. Let's all kind of pull in our belt. I did the producer's speech because I was the producer of one way or the other. Let's pull in our belt. And I agree. We'll go and get a second cast of people, and we'll look around for French nationals, and we'll work with some non-actors, and we'll all kind of chip in together and do the sequence that way. Well, of course, what happened is I did agree to a cast of people that we found there and actors who were not quite so expensive, and I, for my part, made my compromise, but I felt that no one else had that. The set was just, it was this whole house built on the river. And the furniture was this spectacular, expensive furniture that was flown in, and in fact, some of it I still have because I just took it as the guy would put up the dough. And somehow I just, it was very hard. I remember Christian had a very hard time with his lines, and it was just grueling and hot. And I just developed this anger at this scene, although now I love the scene. We did the burial under the French tradition, the French bugle. That was their version of the bugle call used for a moment like this. I'm happy that this is back. I'm happy that the French sequence is back in, because even though I took it out sort of because I was petulant and angry at it, I do love it, actually.
Captain, accept the flag.
And we did the ceremony as according to the French tradition and according to the American tradition, with Albert wearing the captain's hat. It's very touching. Military ceremonies commemorating the dead are, let's face it, they've learned over the years to do that really well.
This food is really wonderful, isn't it? The wine, the sauces. I can't believe it. Hey, can I speak with the chef?
Well, of course, Chef is in heaven here eating this wonderful food prepared by a family who had been there probably for 3-4 generations. And you notice with Lance, Sam, he's just turning into the wild child. step by step, as he's gotten further and further. Those are my two boys. That's Roman reciting the poem, and that's Gio standing next to him. Gio was the tall, lanky boy. Roman was doing the French poem of Baudelaire. He hated doing this.
This is Baudelaire. It's a very cruel poem for children, but they need it, because life sometimes is very cruel, as you can see.
The sequence is interesting because, of course, it wasn't written this way. I sat around with the actors, many of whom were French and had come from France. Others were there. I don't know where we found them, but we discussed the issues concerning the French Indochinese War, Dien Bien Phu. It was still passionate to these folks, and many opinions were put forth. And then listening to them argue and discuss it, I sort of took that information and I wrote it into a scene. It was quite a lot of pages because it covered a lot of interesting political perspective from the point of view of, people who have gone to another country. And as he explains, the rubber wasn't there. The French implanted it and created these plantations and made something from nothing, and now it was being taken away. So all of this information and this dialogue really was partly provided by the actors themselves in discussions and improvisations, and then I sort of wrote it up, and then it became this quite long script, which, of course, we were all worried about because, the movie was already much, much too long. How are we going to have this 6-page scene in it? Walter did a wonderful job in this new version. As I said, he went and cut it from scratch. And he really, whereas we had been shortening and he just bit the bullet and he put the whole scene in. And I think was right in doing so because, if you're there to learn something and to take the entire experience, then you should hear this. You should hear this, that the same war had been fought before, 20 years before by the French. How insane.
This is our home, Captain. Sooner or later, you're gonna get... No!
Also, it's that wonderful thing of a family, is that you're there, and the family's there, and the brother-in-laws are there, and the tutor is there, and the old grandpa is there, and what starts out as as a nice dinner to welcome these Americans turns into a family dinner. And I love the sentiment that, he says that this home, this is what keeps us together. And of course, one by one, they all storm out of the room. So when he says that there's only like 2 people at the table, is what keeps us together, and they're not together.
The Americans. In 1945, after the Japanese War, your president Roosevelt didn't want the French people to stay in Indochina. So, new Americans implant the Viet Minh.
What do you mean? Yeah, that's true. The Viet Cong were invented by the Americans, sir.
It was felt that, at the time in 1979, this type of history lesson, and even said in this colorful family, was, too didactic, too much dialogue, and too strange, and had nothing to do with the Vietnamese War, although it did have to do with it, of course, and so ultimately we lifted it out.
Maybe they hate the American less than the Russian and the Chinese. If tomorrow the Vietnamese are communists, they will be Vietnamese communists.
But I like the movie better with it in. I feel it gives it a very different dimension from if it were just a kind of Vietnamese setting, the fact that we've broken the time barrier and gone back.
Go away. That's finished for all the white people in Indochina. If you're French, American, that's all the same. Go. They want to forget you. Look at them. Look, this is the truth. An egg.
I deliberately tried to have this widow, this mysterious woman who was there on the balcony, played by Aurore Clément, very beautifully, come down the steps and sit down and never say a word. Obviously, I was trying to have you be interested in her, and with everyone else talking, the fact that she didn't say a word, I thought would single her out.
The Philippines, and then maybe Europe. But voyons, pourquoi pas l'Europe? Why not Europe? Look what happened in Czechoslovakia recently. And even before the Second World War, the Americans knew exactly what was going on. They don't want that.
These themes that he's playing on the accordion really were French, Legionnaire themes and tunes associated with the military.
Bullshit. French bullshit. American bullshit. Dien Bien Phu is a trap.
Of course, the 2 things I love most to have in movies is people sitting having dinner and real music, people really playing music, be it a little band in The Godfather or even this accordionist, this old French paratrooper. I'm not sure where he came from. I think we found him in the Philippines. I don't think he came from France. I think only 2 or 3 did.
Mistake. A voluntary mistake. Voluntary.
All the soldiers knew. We knew we would be dead.
The generals and the colonels believe it's impossible for the Viet to get the cannon up there in the mountains. But they do.
This is the perspective on Dien Bien Phu, of course, the big battle in which the French paratroopers attempted to relieve this encircled their compatriots, and the Vietnamese had successfully gotten their artillery up on the hill, and it was sort of like the deciding factor in which the French basically lost the Indo-Chinese War, and then years later, the Americans sort of inherited it. And I meant to show kind of how the same thing had happened. He's talking here about how the students and the protesters were there at home marching against the French soldiers and protesting, and even to the extent of sabotaging the weapons. And of course that was happening in America. And I wanted to have that kind of perspective of how it really had all happened before. Of course with war it always had all happened before. I mean, for thousands of years the same themes are repeated over and over again. It's the curse.
Dien Bien Phu. Okay. The French is shit. No one cares. No one wants to.
Tu me casses les pieds, Lefebvre. Why don't you Americans learn from us, from our mistakes? Mon Dieu, with your army, your strength, your power, you can win if you want to. Sois gentil de relever le pauvre Lefebvre qui est tombé, s'il te plaît. You can win.
I'm sure we can make some.
And the sentiment that the Americans had the might and they had the ability to win if they would only use it. And of course, I guess from many perspectives, whether they had used it or hadn't really used it, whatever, when you fail, it's second-guessed by so many people in so many positions.
Comment voulez-vous que le gouvernement puisse gagner quand il est communiste?
Les communistes ont toujours œuvré pour la paix, où qu'elle soit.
Ils ont tué l'armée entière. L'armée française qui était la plus forte, terminée. À cause de qui? Des communistes.
L'armée s'est tuée elle-même.
Interesting thing about this scene is that Aurora had these earrings, and they were established, and she came back one evening and had lost the other earring, and there was no earring, and there was only one, and the prop men all had to frantically go around and make the other earring. So if you look at the earring on her left ear, you'll see that that's a fake. Why she had lost the earring is another question, and where it finally showed up. But that's all right, because they're married now. Aurora Clement is now Mrs. Dean Tavares, and they live very happily in Paris. And they met on this film and in this scene. I like Christian very much. He had a very tough time with all these lines. The scene was pieced together out of little fragments. Indeed, Christian had been cursed with Alzheimer's, and as he grew older, he lost his memory completely, and he died several years ago, but really he had died years before that with no memory at all. And I think back on how frustrated I was and how angry I was that he couldn't kind of remember his lines, and of course now I feel pretty badly that I felt that way.
Something out of nothing. So when you ask me why we want to stay here, Captain, we want to stay here because it's ours, it belongs to us. It keeps our family together. I mean, we fight for that. Well, you Americans...
This is, yes, where he says, this piece of land, we fight for it because it keeps our family together. And of course, they've all left. I guess that's the same theme of The Godfather. Michael did what he did to keep his family together, and then the family's obliterated.
I will see if your man needs any help to repair your boat so that you can go on with your war.
Aurora is in Sophia's picture, Marie Antoinette. She plays one of the nobles. She has a wonderful line. I love it. She says, well, how can you live in a place where your rank is not assured?
I apologize for my family, Captain. We have all lost much.
I couldn't resist the moment of a kind of a love theme, although a very dreamy one. I mean, here she is a widow. Here he is, this lost soul who had a wife, but ultimately lost her in a different way, and they come together in this moment as the sun is going down. There's a wonderful story about this for me, which is that When we added the love scene between Roy Clement and Martin Sheen, we wanted it to be like a break in the movie and have a romantic Debussy kind of theme. And of course, this was in 2000, and Carmine had passed away, and we didn't have him to write the theme. And so I suggested that we look through all of my dad's symphonic work and see if we could find a theme from something else and then redo it in the style that the score had been. And as we looked through all these papers and stuff, we found one piece of paper, the edge was torn off, and it said something we couldn't read totally, and we realized it said love theme. And when we played it, I realized that that's what it was. My dad had written the theme for this scene, and when I heard it, I realized, yes, I must have, I had talked to him. I said I wanted something like Debussy with those lush harmonies, and he had done it. And so we took this one piece of paper that had this orchestral sketch on it. We did give it to synthesis and orchestrate it, and it is the composer contributing to the score long after he had passed away. This is quite a spectacular shot if you realize not only has Victorio orchestrated this movement bringing you around, but that at the moment that you can see the outside, it's sort of a perfect moment of the sun going down.
Then you're like us. Your home is here.
I remember that I had wanted them, as a very Indo-Chinese thing to do, I wanted her to prepare an opium pipe for him. And of course, none of us knew anything about opium, and I had no idea how to instruct her to do it or prepare it or smoke it or what you did. So we inquired with our liaison to the government, is there any way that someone could tell us about opium and tell us how to do the scene? And so the next thing, we were pretty highly connected in the Philippine government, and they were very kind to us and very cooperative. And I must say, my whole experience with Apocalypse Now, I don't recall one incident where we were pressured to pay a bribe or to do those types of things that often can happen when you're totally in the control of a foreign country. It was they really came through with what was promised. They did, and I have only the most wonderful things to say about the Philippine people. They took us to heart. They worked very hard on this film. We became very attached to many of them. And the government, no matter what you might think, they delivered on their word. At any rate, they brought this guy out of jail who had been a prisoner, who was in prison for smoking opium or selling opium or something, and they said this man would be an expert on it, and he would tell us. And so we had Aurora, and we had Dean and Martin, and I said, okay, well, here's the pipe, is that right, what do you do? And they had also the police had brought a little lump of opium so the guy could really show us, and he said, well, yes, you do this, and he took the opium, and he showed us how to do it, and he held a pipe and he did it, and then he basically smoked all the opium. And so then they took him back to prison, and it was all gone. And he must have thought, wow, what a great job. They took me out of jail and they gave me this opium, and I told these fellas how to smoke it, and then I just smoked it, and then he went back to jail probably feeling very relaxed.
All that matters is that you are alive. You are alive, Captain. That's the truth.
I know so many people who are forlorn and frustrated and unhappy and depressed. And, I must say that I think, wow, well, we're alive. We have this privilege to be alive. And her husband is not alive. And we're not going to be alive forever. We're going to die. So while you're alive, why not see it in the most positive light? Try to look at the wonderful elements that everybody has in their life. I'm sure, even some of those very tragic situations still, it's better than not being alive. It's better than not having had this opportunity to know one another, to see this extraordinary earth that we have. So, in a sense, what she tells him, I think there's some truth that he has made it through, as all of us talking about it at least have.
There are two of you, don't you see? One that kills, and one that loves.
So clearly this part in the fog is where we would be had the French plantation not been put back in, and we would have gone to the sequence in the fog, which is coming next. But I think the French plantation And what happened was, and that history lesson and even the sort of poetic stuff that happened with the widow was a welcome break to now to go on into an even more surreal part of the film. Now, this was taken quite a bit from the Heart of Darkness book. As I said, I had this little green paperback, them in the fog and the arrows getting shot at them and these strange totems on the sides of the shore and strange voices moving to a very primitive time, these almost occult symbols on the shores. I think at this point, I didn't, as I said, I didn't have a script for the ending, and so I think I just basically didn't have a script. I wish I could find that copy of Heart of Darkness I had, because I had it all marked up. It was a green paperback, and at that point, that's all I was referring to.
I couldn't see him yet, but I could feel him. As if the boat were being sucked upriver and the water was flowing back into the jungle. Whatever was going to happen, it wasn't going to be the way they call it back in the Trang.
So this is very much exactly Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad. Don't ask me why I did this, but for some reason, as I said, I like to be available to anything that happens and try to incorporate it. I just decided that Lance should take an arrow and break it in half and make one of those rigs where it looks like it's gone through his head and play the next part of the movie with this arrow going through his head. And in a sense, it's that same predilection of like having Willard have a bandage on his face because he had tripped on his rifle, even though there's no scene in the movie where he tripped on the rifle to justify the bandage. But nonetheless, Lance has an arrow going through his head. Again, exactly out of the Heart of Darkness of Conrad. Wasn't in the script. There was no script at this point. How chilling, the thought of here he is, a modern man in modern American army, and he's killed in a way he might have been killed 300 years before. Again, the theme of being back in time, and this could have been just a tribal spear thrown at his ancestor. By then, I guess I was pretty sure that one by one, the crew on the boat were all going to lose their life one way or the other. Here, the colored smoke, our familiar friend, and Lance with his arrow in his head and his face makeup on and his makeup kit. He's so spaced out. Sam Bottoms evolved this character really out of the experience of working on the film. Imagine if we had to shoot this scene, because of schedule reasons first. It would have been a realistic kid, Lance, trying to bury the chief. It would have been, it's very odd. Had we started this movie because of schedule reasons at this point, how interesting that it would have all been super realistic, and only took on this tone because we had been going on the journey ourselves and we were changing as we were making the film. Beautiful theme my father wrote, this musical theme here.
I thought you were going in to blow up a bridge or some fucking railroad tracks or something. No, wait, we'll go together. On the boat, we'll go with you.
So really, those kinds of things you do, like making the decision to make this arrow rig when I did, you have to live with it, and he had to have been wearing it throughout that whole sequence, and now in a very serious scene such as the burial of the chief, that arrow's on his head, and had it been a wrong decision, had it been just absurd, of course it was absurd, and maybe at this point, the movie was embracing all absurdities, but it's just interesting to realize how when you make those decisions and decide, well, I'm going to do this, that then you live with it for a while. And that's how a lot of things happened in this film. So I talked about the bandage, but that little dog, the fact that he took the dog and only lost the dog in the scene of the firefight when he kept saying, "Where's the dog? Where's the dog?" So we picked up these things like props and ideas like hitchhikers and took them for a while to see where they would take us. At this point, I knew I was getting pretty close to this payoff scene, and this is a movie in itself. Is the the entrance of Marlon Brando into our lives. I'd made a deal with Marlon Brando. I think it was for $3 million to come and work with us for 4 weeks. And he was very specific. He wouldn't work past 5:30 in the day. He would only work on the weekdays. It was very strict, the contract. He had honed his skills in dealing with studios, and so he, of course, applied that to me. So when he was going to come, I really was on the spot because I didn't really exactly know what his part would be, because the old script really required him to be a fit Green Beret commander. And Marlon had thrown a lot of left hooks into the picture. Like, for one thing, is he didn't want to be called Kurtz. He felt it was wrong to be called Kurtz. He thought Kurtz was such a, abrupt and Germanic name. He wanted it to be something lovely, so he suggested he wanted to be called Colonel Lely. Colonel Lely, Leighley. And I said, Lely? And he says, yes, it'd be beautiful. You should have a beautiful name, Lely. If you look carefully in the movie, you'll see that in some of the sequences, they refer to someone as Colonel Kurtz, but if you look at their lips, they're saying Lely, because it was only after I kind of retook control of the situation that I made him Kurtz again. Marlon, a man of incredible intellect, aside from his wonderful acting and his great talent as an actor, just as a man who talks about interesting things, and extremely brilliant man, one of the few really brilliant men I've ever met. But he has a lot of techniques to sabotage the situation, to give him a kind of, I don't know why, but maybe he feels if he could break up and disrupt everything, then it should be. This sequence, I think I once saw a documentary about Indonesia or something, and saw something like this, and I liked it because I felt the sequence, it signified now we were back in prehistoric time, and or prehistory. We had gone back 1,000 years, and in entering that cordon of the men and boys on the boat covered in white clay, as they do in certain tribes, that we had now arrived at the time. An interesting thing, in my conception for Apocalypse Now, I wanted it to have no credits, no names and credits on it and stuff. And I didn't. When the film came out, there was just a program, but there was no credit sequences on the picture. But it had to have the word Apocalypse Now with a copyright sign on it so that it would be copywritten. Now, you'll notice on the wall it says our motto, Apocalypse Now. That is for legal purposes because there were no credits. I have to tell you about Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper was a wonderful actor and a director, and I was very thrilled to have him work on this film. And he was going to play the part of the Green Beret fellow who had gone up before Willard to assassinate him and then joined him. But when I got there and I saw Dennis and saw the kind of condition he was in, which was sort of as you see him, again, as I said, I was only using the Heart of Darkness book. And there's a character in Heart of Darkness known as the Russian, and he's described as being this kind of strange guy. He's a Russian, and he's dressed in a kind of almost a harlequin kind of clothes. And the book, those of you who know the book or you refer to it, you'll see that character. And just looking at Dennis Hopper, what he looked like, I just said, wow, I'm not going to have you play Colby, the officer, Green Beret officer who goes there. I'm going to have you be a kind of new version of this Russian in the book. And I literally got some Montagnard type of jacket and put it on him. And I remember reading about a famous photojournalist named Sean Flynn, I think the son of Errol Flynn, who was a war photographer in Vietnam. I think ultimately disappeared or was lost, and was famous for his behavior, I guess the drug-induced behavior. And I thought, well, what if I kind of concocted a character right that first day when I met Dennis? And I remember literally taking the clothes and sort of dressing him like that and putting cameras on him, making him a photojournalist. I mean, this did not exist in the script. This was like the arrows in the head or any of these things, just doing it on the cuff. And took another actor, Scott Glenn, and had him play Colby. You'll see him shortly. And really had no idea of what to do with Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper, however, was in rare form. He's such a brilliant person, such an intelligent person, Dennis. And in those days, he was living pretty much on the edge. And this stuff sort of poured out of him, and we would talk, and he would say these things, in our discussions and rehearsals, and I'd type them up and then make that be the script. And then, of course, he would improvise on top of that. This is altogether a creation of Dennis Hopper, that he took this cue that, and I assume he read the book. I don't know if he was conditioned to read, but he looked at the character in the book, the Russian. Somehow this emerged. This I don't know what we called him, the photojournalist.
Very cool. Lay back, dig it. He gets friendly again. He really does. But you don't judge a colonel. You don't judge a colonel like an ordinary man. Okay, watch it now. These are Americans. Americans. Feel the vibe of this place.
Now that tall fellow with the green beret hat with the shotgun is Colby. Colby is the man who wrote the letter. Sell the kid, sell the car, forget it, I'm never coming home. That's Charlie Robertson, one of his men. Charlie Robertson was a wonderful fellow. Scott Glenn is a wonderful person. I must say I love my cast, but then over my career, I've always felt the closest to the actors because they do so much for their parts. So right on the cuff, I had Scott Glenn was just going to play one of the fellas there, and I said, okay, you're going to be Colby. And so he cooked up this character, and he had the shotgun. He was going to get a obsession with the shotgun and paint his face with blood and stuff.
The heads. You're looking at...
A lot of these heads that you see on the pavement there, on the dirt and on the stairs, of course, are real people who... there's holes dug in the ground, and they're just waiting. You know, after the take, we would put umbrellas over them so that they would be cooler. But they're living people down there in the ground. And one of them, my very good friend Tony Dingman, who remembers this as one of the most horrible experiences of his life, being stuck in that hole for all those hours, even with the umbrella and the water.
He's gone away. He disappeared out in the jungle with his people.
You see that with Chef. He's put a banana leaf on his head. Everyone's gone pretty native here.
He forgets himself. Captain.
I'm leading up to this big moment where you're going to see Brando, and I still don't know what's going to happen when you see him. Now, the real shocker for me is that when Brando arrived, when I met him in California for this part, he was big, but he said, because we had worked on The Godfather, he's going to, lose a lot of this weight. And, of course, we had to have costumes. In other words, if he was going to be a Green Beret colonel, he had to wear army clothes. He had to look like a Green Beret colonel. But when I saw Marlon, he was gigantic. He was bigger than a water buffalo. He was so big. He had gained weight to the proportion that, unfortunately, we know of in his later life that he did. Marlon was very embarrassed about it. He's not to say the least, he's not an unfeeling person. He's a very, very strong feeling person. So I said to him, well, we can't play him as a Green Beret colonel because he's so big. But what if we show when Willard finally sees him that what if he's this great big guy and he's kind of got a sarong on and he's eating a mango and he's got his arm around a cute native girl? And Brando said, no, I don't want to do that. And I realized I was very touched that he was shy about it. He didn't want to be portrayed or have the fact that he was so big to be made part of the scene, which is, of course, as I said, I was in the mood on this picture of basically taking it as it came and try to incorporate it. So I was totally resolved to just write it another way and just use the fact that he was very big and fat, but he didn't want to do that. And so I'm really thinking, well, how am I going to get around this? And we had not trailers for the actors, but sort of houseboats because we were on the water. And so the first day Marlon was there, we had a big houseboat. It was air conditioned and quite nice. And in the morning, I went down there, and of course I was in a cold sweat all night because I had no idea what I was going to have him do, and I didn't even know how to give him a costume. In the morning in the houseboat, we sat and we talked, and he talked and talked. Very fascinating stuff. He talked about, for 2 hours, about termites and the behavior and intelligence of termites, and also geckos and things. And I have nothing but respect for Marlon Brando, and as I said, he's brilliant. I mean, what he was saying was fascinating, of course, about termites, even though it didn't have anything to do with my very serious problem, which was, how am I going to dress you and what are we going to do for these 3 weeks? And, it was hours were going by, and there was a knock on the door from the assistant director and said, well, Francis, you going to come out or should I just send the crew to lunch? So I said, I'll send the crew to lunch. And I continued talking to Marlon. And I said, well, Marlon, what about the possibility of doing it more like Heart of Darkness? Because at that point, I just decided that was my Bible. I was going to do Heart of Darkness. I had been doing it. I did it with Dennis Hopper. And he said, no. He said, that won't work. And I said, well, what if, his head is like a skull and there's no hair? And, we do that. He said, no, that'll never work. And he started talking about other stuff and telling me ideas about Vietnam. It had nothing to do with the movie. He told me this story about how in a village in Vietnam, the Americans had come and had inoculated the children against polio, and how they left them with the children, protected. And then a week they came back, and the Viet Cong had come and cut off all the inoculated arms. And stories like that Marlon was telling me. And next thing I know is there's a knock on the door, and the assistant director says, "Well, it's getting late. Should we send the crew home?" And I said, "Well, I guess, yeah." Send the crew home. And this went on for 4 days, sitting in the trailer with the guy knocking, saying, "Should we send him home for lunch?" And saying, "Well, okay, he's not ready, really." And I really started, I thought my life was over, because the film was way, way, way over budget. The interest rates when I started the movie, I think, were like 7%, but in the course of the time I was making it, they had gone up to 29%, so the interest was killing us. And I began to realize that Marlon was just going to kind of sit in the houseboat and talk. And, it was already halfway through the first week, and he was going to do this for 3 weeks. And then he was going to say, "Well, the 3 weeks are up, and I'm going to leave. If you want me to stay longer, will you give me another $2-3 million, and I'll stay another 3 weeks." And so I started to realize I have to do whatever I can to, like, shake this loose. And I guess I realized, well, what I could do is, and I told this to Marlon. I said, "Marlon, one of the problems is how you want to be shown and what you want to look like." And so, a very heavy man has broad shoulders, and a very hugely tall man has broad shoulders. And since we're shooting you usually from your head and shoulders and your hands, we don't know that you're fat. So if I could have a double who is a giant man who's like 7 feet tall, you'll look like a giant. And in fact, I had such a man, Pete Cooper, who was our advisor of the PBR boat, who had been in the service in those boats. And I said I could have him look like a really giant-sized man. So, he thought of this, and that night we left, and of course I went home, and as I was every night, I was just like, in a cold sweat and heartbroken, because not only did I not have an ending, and not only was I going to lose Marlon Brando shortly, but, it was all my home and my vineyard, which at that point was, I didn't know all that well, but it was all there with the bank, and so it wasn't just an artistic fall from grace, it was going to be a financial one as well. So I came to work the next morning, and I was astounded, because there was Marlon Brando, and he had no hair. He had cut all his hair off. And I remember saying to him, "But Marlon, that's like Kurt's in the book. I thought you said that wouldn't work, that you read Heart of Darkness, and that the Kurt says he's in the book wouldn't work." And he looked at me with a little kind of puckish smile, and he said, "Well, I lied." I said, "You lied? What do you mean?" He said, "I never read Heart of Darkness. I read it last night, and this morning I cut off my hair." So, torn between fury that for like 5 days I'd been talking to him after he rejected the idea of like having a skull-like head, saying that he read it and it wouldn't work. Now that I saw, what a cosmic practical joker he was, except he was playing with my life, saying that he hadn't even read it. And now, of course, I was overjoyed that he had cut his hair off, and he had this, magnificent, Marlon has always had this magnificent face, and here we are seeing him bald. And so sure enough, I got them to get some huge extra large size black pajamas, which I am told I still have that set of pajamas. I noticed recently he auctioned off everything, including letters from me. I have his large pajamas. I could auction that off, but I won't. And at any rate, I went to Victoria and said, "Victoria, we have to start. He's going to leave in a few weeks." And Victoria says, "Don't worry, Francis." But Victoria was like a prince. Victoria would be wearing white and could fall in the mud, and he would get up and not have a spot on him. "He's Francis. We put him there. We put him in the shadow and the light. We do something. We just start." So we went up and we put Marlon in the room where he was, and Vittorio lit him where there was just a little ray of light. And indeed, Marlon, who was very conscious of what the camera is on and what the camera is seeing, he acted with his bald head. He played that beam of light almost as though he could see through the camera, and he gave you a little hint of a little top of his head, and then he went back into the darkness and showed you another sliver of himself. And it's true, I think in the houseboat, Marlon had said, that a character like this, you can never really see him. You can give the audience some razor slices of him and just kind of a little bit. And that's what we did. And so we began. It was about the 4th day, so there was only one more day of that week and then 2 more weeks, and that was it. But with Vittorio's wonderful attitude, we just start, Francis, we just take some shots, and that's all right, because I was ready to jump off the boat and just end it there. So we started to do that, and we did a scene with Willard first talking to him in the shadows, and I must say that beautiful line about the flowers by the river, that was all a memory that Marlon really had. I think he was stalling because he didn't know how to do it either. And just as I didn't have a concept on how to continue, he didn't. And so he was talking about termites and things. I may be hoping that I would glean something here or there, put together an idea. But once there was a breakthrough, once we had decided that at least it's going to be like the book, then we had a way to go. And Marlon poured out some extraordinary personal memories that are referred to in that first scene. And even that line, are you an assassin? I'm a soldier. No, you're a grocery boy sent by merchants to collect the bill. That was Marlon's line.
Oh, yeah. He's dying, I think.
So I think once he had a direction to go, then he started to go, and we started to shoot every day. Also, Dennis Hopper, I would do scenes with Dennis Hopper. I'm not sure whether I was shooting the scenes with Dennis Hopper, because once I started with Marlon, I was pretty much focused on Marlon, but I think Marlon began to become very impatient with Dennis, although I suspect he did it as a character thing. A lot of times an actor will, detest a particular other actor and not want to be in his presence and stuff, but it's really, he thinks that's good for the part and the relationship. But Marlon was very impatient and would throw bananas at him and call him a mutt. I think he does in the movie. But in real life, too, he wouldn't, see him, or he would always be disdainful of him.
Bullshit, man. Am I gonna be the one that's gonna set them straight? Look at me wrong.
You. Almost 8 hours. I'm asleep. I'm asleep and dreaming I'm on this shitty boat.
Almighty. This is PBR Street Gang. Radio check, over. PBR Street Gang, this is Almighty standing by, over.
And meanwhile, I was weaving together what plot I could, the idea that Lance had gone native and that there was a radio call that could call in an airstrike if they had to. I had no idea of which way the story was going to go, and I would just kind of each day invent something. And one day on the call sheet, Freddie Forrest got on the call sheet that there would be Chef's head, and he didn't know he was going to even die in the movie. So Freddie really said, "What is this, my head? This means I'm over, I'm done, there's going to be my head." And I said, "Well, Freddie, that's, we think it'd be really interesting if Marlon went in there by the boat because you were at the boat, and it'd be an interesting plot turn if, like, he just comes and dumps your head in Martin Sheen's lap." And as I said, there was no script, so these things were just like each night we would dream up something and it would go out on a call sheet. And Freddie got the call sheet that we were going to make him up to be a cut-off head, and we did. Well, that finished off another member of the crew, so now pretty much all there was Willard, Martin, and Lance. And I felt, Lance was such a nature's child. He was such a blessed figure in the state that maybe Lance would be the one character who makes it to the end. The Connex container, this is the metal container that we're seeing, sequence was taken out in the original picture, but I always really liked the sequence because all it was, of course, he's holding Willard prisoner in there, and you see all these cute little kids, these little Montagnard kids. They're really Ifugao kids. Were so adorable, and I loved being with the Ifugao people and the children so much. The idea was that Marlon would just kind of, after letting him bake in that metal box for a while, he would just come and bring a lot of clippings from Time magazine. And I really had collected a bunch of real Time magazine articles, which in effect were essentially saying that the Americans were winning the war. And this is the kind of anti-lie theme that I talk about, is that if the government, if the publications, if people lie about things, then there can be no morality, because the lie does away with the natural check that would happen if people really had to deal with what the truth was. They wouldn't permit it. And so governments over history, the organs of state and what have you, are often lying. And really that's the theme of Heart of Darkness. He has the line, I think, where he says something like, "I hate the stench of a lie," or something to that effect. Oh, those three little kids there, that's Huey, Dewey, and Louie. There were these three little wonderful girls that would follow me everywhere I would go, and I used to call them Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And I was so happy when I put the sequence back in because I saw them again, and gee, they must be grown ladies and have their own children by now, but they were always together, the three little girls. So Marlon reads these actual articles. You can see that, I mean, he didn't have a script. Those were the pages out of Time magazine that I gave him. And of course the point was clear, is that, you know, you, Captain Willard, are coming up here to murder me because I'm up here practicing warfare that could ultimately win this conflict. And yet you represent a government and a country that lies about what it's doing. And, you know, in those days I was particularly annoyed at the old Time magazine because they were always so high and mighty about putting your films down. They even had a writer for Time magazine who reviewed Apocalypse Now. He said it was the biggest disaster made in Hollywood in 40 years. And I was so hurt. I thought, my God, is it the biggest disaster in 40 years? Or is it really the worst film made in 40 years? Isn't there some other movie that's a little worse? Am I maybe just like the third worst movie ever made? Am I the worst movie ever made? So I confess I was annoyed at Time magazine for, you know, kind of preaching in such a self-grandizing way. And here they were in the Vietnamese War, kind of writing on their hallowed pages to the public this stuff about how in fact it was coming straight from, I guess, their publisher, of how we were winning the war, which obviously we weren't. I did the scene a little bit, you know, because of that. And ultimately I took it out of the picture, not because worried about anything related to that, because in fact all I did was read their published pages. I wasn't making anything up. When we did the long version, I decided to put the scene back in, and of course it's wonderful because it's another scene with Marlon. By now I began to feel that, you know, one way or the other, I was going to just barrel through this, and the way we had been going, just taking every idea, every opportunity that I could pick up along the way and do my best to fashion it into a series of scenes which hopefully we could cut together into an ending. So much of what Marlon had even been talking about in the houseboat was fascinating, and I would record it, and I was continuing to talk to him, and there began to be this technique evolve where I would record, you know, 5 hours of conversation, and then I would go home, and I'm not sure if someone transcribed it for me. Maybe I had a wonderful assistant in those days named Luli. She was a Filipina lady. She was a wonderful, wonderful person as my assistant and secretary, and later she came back as my secretary to America for years until, unfortunately, she had an illness and died. But whether Luli was typing these hours up for me, and then I would go through and I would, just like with the French, because this had become the technique, the French plantation, I would take all these discussions and talk and improvisations and then fashion them into a scene. And then when we came in the morning, I would give those pages to the actor and we would do them. There's no question that this imagery, much of which was shot, by the way, by Steve Burham, who was our second unit photographer shooting many of those scenes, inspired the artist Robert Peake to do the painting that ultimately became the poster logo for Apocalypse Now, and I believe Apocalypse Now Redux. Of course, Marlon has become famous at this point for needing cue cards, and we would make cue cards for him, and we even began another technique where we would put a little earphone in his ear, and he would record some of his lines, and then he had the switch in his pocket, and he would play it, and he would sort of cue himself. I've always felt from knowing Marlon that part of his style of acting has to do with the fact that he didn't have a good memory, you know, so he would kind of, you know, say a line and say, well, I was going to do this and I'm going to do that, and, you know, that is him trying to remember his line. Again, this is the show a sliver of him, an array of light type of moment, to show as little of Marlon as you possibly can. And in a way, you know, cinema is sort of more like poetry than literature, and it's all about expressing things and saying things that you don't say, trying to say it another way, to use metaphor or simile or synecdoche or any of these other poetic techniques where you express one thing by, in fact, showing something quite different, and the audience puts it together. And cinema is at its best when it expresses things without really expressing them. Marlon was attempting to literally grab and catch a fly, which is hard to do. And if you look carefully at that shot, you see that he did. He caught the fly, and the fly flies out of his hand.
We're the hollow men. We're the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry.
Part of my literary, if I can call it that, or my writing attempt, I tried absolutely everything. And at one point, an old school chum of mine who was quite brilliant, very eccentric, but nonetheless quite brilliant, named Dennis Jacob. He's a sort of legendary figure. I went to UCLA with him, and really he was one of my first friends, and I was always very fond of him, and he was a wonderful person and a brilliant person. As he got older, he got stranger and stranger, and in the course of our lives and career happening, and his kind of went another way. He kind of was one of those wonderful friends and people that's sort of like a potential booby trap. I think we all know those people that if you say the wrong thing or if you do the wrong thing, it could turn out to be a... By the way, that throwing the book and calling him mutt was for real. But Dennis had come at my behest to the Philippines because I was desperate. I just didn't know a way to thematically pull this all together. And I had many conversations with Dennis, who was very knowledgeable about many things. And it was Dennis who came up with this idea that perhaps you need this primal myth notion. And I said, primal myth, what's that? It's, well, this idea that there is this, I guess it's the Golden Bough, which is the fantastic book related to myth, and the idea that, ultimately the first thing human beings dealt with was just the fact that there's basically life and death, that the sun is up and then the sun goes down, that there's the spring and then there's the winter, that this eternal return, as the Mircea Eliade would call it, is that it's a cycle that created an early myth which has to do with the killer going to kill the king and ultimately killing the king and becoming the new king, because human beings are aware of this cycle of life in which there is death and rebirth. That's the primal myth. And it's written about in T.S. Eliot and his work, and in The Hollow Men. It's of course in the book From Ritual to Romance, The Golden Bough. And so talking to Dennis about this, I said, well, Kurtz is reading that stuff, and that's why I referenced those books, because as I was shooting this, I was hot on the trail of a possible ending, and the ending would be that, in a sense, the killer in this myth was Willard, and he was going up there to kill the king, which was Kurtz, and that all I had to do was have him kill him. That, in a sense, it was a ritual killing, that the king wanted to be killed, because that is what makes then there be a new spring and the crops grow, and that it is as part and as old and ancient and as part of human myth and human life as could possibly be. So it made my job a lot easier.
To describe what is necessary to those who do not know what...
Dennis really didn't say to me, okay, yeah, just do this. But Dennis filled my head with this idea of this story of the killer who goes up there, and referenced The Hollow Man and these various other literary pieces and books on myth. And I said, well, this makes it very easy, because it means all I have to do is I just have to kill him. That Willard just will kill him, and that's the ending that I needed. But somehow, out of killing him, something new grows and something bigger comes of all of it. And so then I was resolved, well, that's what I'm going to do.
I remember when I was with Special Forces. Seems 1,000 centuries ago. We went into a camp to inoculate some children.
One of those evenings, I was home, in my traditional cold sweat. My wife, Eleanor, was shooting a documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, and she came home very excited, and she had spent all night with the ceremonies of the Ifugao people. Now, to explain the Ifugao people are native people who live in the Philippines, much as the Montagnards, who were peoples who lived in the mountains, lived in Vietnam. They were really a different ethnic background, and they lived in the same land, and they were, in the case of these people, the Ifugao, they had been headhunters, really, until very, very recently. They lived in communities quite differently than your normal type of Philippine community. And I had, with the art director, Dean Tavaleros, we had an idea, and we had a young production assistant named Eva Gardos, who in fact became a director that had come to help us, and a very bright young lady. And I said, Eva, I want you to go to the area where the Ifugao people live, up in the rice paddies up in the mountains, and I want you to kind of meet with the chief and I want you to be my emissary and tell them that I would like them to come with their whole tribe and live on our set, and we'll build a set according to houses that they would like, the village, and I want them to be in the movie. We'll be shooting their community, and this young girl goes up there, and she, in fact, pulls it off. And the entire tribe of the Ifugao people moved down to our set. We built them a village right there, and they were living there while we were building it. And they had a contract that we were going to be paid. But part of their contract was very interesting. Every day they had to have so many chickens to sacrifice. Once a week they'd have a pig to sacrifice. And the sacrificial ceremonies of their rituals were more important than the money. And of course they had to have, for the really big celebration they had to have a water buffalo to sacrifice, or 2 water buffaloes to sacrifice. And my wife had just come back with this saran wrap object in a bag, and she says, you have to see this ritual. They prayed all through the night, and then the next morning they killed a caribou. They hacked it to death with machete, and it was their tradition. And of course, the caribou was supplied by the production as part of the contract. And since you're the big chief, they were very concerned you weren't there, and they wanted me to bring you the heart of the animal because they wanted to present it to you as a thing to honor you. And here was this large heart of a caribou to honor me. And I said, well, what should I do with it? And she said, well, I don't know. I maybe you're supposed to eat it. So I said, well, put it in the freezer and I'll get around to it. But, I have a tack now of what I'm going to do. Willard is just going to come up here and he's going to be the killer. Like he was sent to kill Kurtz, and he's going to kill Kurtz, and that's the ending. And it struck me that the people killing the caribou, in a way, was the same thing. She said it wasn't like a scary thing or a horrific thing, that it was like Thanksgiving. The children were laughing and the old people were smiling, and it was like being with the family on Thanksgiving, that the caribou being killed was symbolic of that life would go on.
Everything I did, everything...
By the way, that Kurtz is not Kurtz. That's Pete Cooper, this immense, tall guy, which is how we tried to make it look like Marlon is not really heavy.
If you understand me, Willard, you will do this for me.
So once I had this notion that Marlon was the caribou of the Ifugao people, it turned out that in their contract, the main sacrifice was the second caribou, and it was going to be coincidental of the last night of the shooting. Well, that put me in a tremendously moral quandary, because since the animal was really going to be killed by the people, of course I wanted to incorporate Lance, who by now had almost become one of them. But it was very interesting because they were going to say the prayers. I had a bunch of stuff to shoot. It was getting to be the last day. I had to have Willard come out of the pond with the knife. He had to go up to do all this stuff. So they said, well, listen, kill the caribou, have the people sacrifice the caribou earlier in the evening, because if something doesn't work out right, then you can have another caribou and you can kill the other caribou and you can, it's like take 2. I said, I can't have take 2 of killing of a caribou. If they're going to kill the caribou as part of their sacrifice, it has to be holy. And we have to do it at the very last shot. They said, well, if you do it at the last shot, if the light comes up, it could all be ruined. We suggest that you don't do everything else first, but that you do get the slaughter of the caribou. And I said, I can't do it. It seems to me wrong. That, in a sense, I'm not asking for the animal to be killed. The animal is going to be killed because it is their ritual, and all I'm going to do is film it. So I have to shoot all of this other stuff of Marty, putting war paint and climbing stealthily to kill him. And in some way, I have to make the analogy that he is going to kill the king, Kurtz. And I have to make the analogy that it's the same as the caribou being killed, because that's how life will go forward out of this ritual killing. They have to do it when they're going to do it. And I can't do 2 animals. I mean, if I do 2 animals, then I'm just killing this animal. I don't want to do that, So we shot all of the scene, and the light was getting closer and closer, and they said, it's not going to work. And we're hurrying up, and Willard has got the war paint, and he sneaks up there and does all this ritualistic with his knife and what have you. And the animal is there, and the people want to continue with their ceremony to kill the caribou. But I said they can't kill it until we shoot all this other stuff, because it must be the last thing of the night. It must be and of the sequence, by the way. That it would be bad, bad karma to not have, when the animal is killed, to have it be killed in a sacred way. So everyone is dying because, the sun comes up. Once the sun comes up, it's not going to be night anymore in the early morning. And it's all going to be, what are we going to do? We can't come back the next day and do it. And of course, we just barely made it. And Marlon did his last The Horror, and he had this tape recorder in his ear, so he was able to do some of his lines. And it was pretty tense because essentially the sacrifice was going to be the last thing of the picture, of the sequence, and it had to be. In my mind, at that point, I was convinced that if I interceded in this sacrificial killing, it would be very, very bad. And in fact, the light was starting to come up, and the people, we shot the work with Marty and Marlon earlier, and then of course the people did their sacrifice unfettered by me, and it was all cut together to ultimately be the ritual killing of the king. And Martin, the assassin, in fact, completing his mission. Really, the ending was there in front of my face the whole time, and I couldn't see it. That ultimately all I had to do was for him, the killer, to go up and kill the king. We killed only that one animal, or they killed the one animal. There was a second animal, but I said I wouldn't, for movie purposes, have two animals killed, and we didn't. I can recall my little daughter, Sophia. She was such an interesting kid. And once she was very sick, and she was in a sweat. She must have been 7 or 8 years old, I don't know. And she was all in a sweat, and she was there and, almost semi-conscious. And I leaned and got very close to her, and she whispered to me, the horror. It's amazing the influence of bringing your kids everywhere you went when you made movies and having them see everything or participate. And indeed, this last sequence, if you notice, the people are smiling. This is, again, just the coverage of their ritual. I basically did nothing but film it, but you see it's joyous. And I did put Lance into the scene with them, but their faces are like it's a wonderful thing. Well, my thought was, now Willard had killed the king, and so he was the king. And he goes out to the people, and you think he had just killed their god, their Kurtz, that maybe they would just all descend upon him and tear him to pieces. But I had this inspiration that when he actually steps out, that I wanted really a lot of people out there, and I shocked the production team. I said, I want 500 people when he steps out the door, and they all scampered around to get people. This was from the John Milius script, though his notes just had scribbled on it, drop the bomb, exterminate them all. It was to show that Kurtz had gone so totally morally mad that in his notes of this piece he was writing, this intellectual treatise on morality, that you could see he was a madman, and he just said, drop the bomb, exterminate them all, in some sort of scrawled madman's writing, and just to show that, in fact, this Colonel Kurtz had been a total lunatic. John Milius is an extraordinarily talented person and a very entertaining person to talk to, and people think that he's, because he's always talking about this violent stuff, guns and what have you, he loves guns, but, indeed he really is one of the sweetest people that exists, and underneath that exterior, there are people I've met, John, even Oliver Stone's a little bit like it, where they're, really macho guys and stuff, but they're really extremely sweet and almost like a kid in a sense, but John is a very lovable person. This was the scene where he steps out, and I had wanted, 500 natives there, and he steps out on the front of the thing, and they are not hostile to him. They accept him as the new king, and he's there with the notes of Kurtz in his hand, and the sword that did the deed in his right hand. And this meant a lot to me, and they all sit down as though, tell us, king, what should we do? And I don't know if this particularly worked, but in my heart, what I wanted was that as this new point of authority, he looks at them and he throws away the sword, as if to say, no more weapons, no more war, no more killing. Because if the king throws away the sword, then all the people who follow him will throw away their weapons. And of course I meant this as a gesture to the idea that if you go in, if you descend into the horror and come out, and there is going to be a new day, a new king, a new spring, and the people will follow the leader, if the leader understands that the only way to defeat the cycle of war is to embrace love. Sound hokey, but it's the truth. Is to give up the weapons and live a life as opposite from war as possible, and set that example, that perhaps then the cycle could be broken. And symbolically, I was intending, that he takes Lance by the hand, who represents a kind of lost youth, and he takes him by the hand and he leads them back to the boat. And I had mined this Kurt's compound, which was like Angkor Wat, with explosives. And whereas there was this potential to call in the airstrike and blow it all up, I said, but all those people, I showed 1,000 people there. We can't blow up the temple. What will happen to all the people? And I said, well, I'll have him play the siren and it'll scare them away, and they won't get hurt if they blow up the temple. And then I thought, well, my goodness, blowing up the temple is just kind of more warfare. And they're saying, Francis, you're crazy. You spent $100,000 mining this temple with explosives. Yeah, and you tell me you're not, I said, well, we'll blow it up, but I at the end, I think he should leave, and there should be peace, that there's a new day, and there's a new king, and he's thrown away his weapons. Somehow it feels wrong for me to drop bombs on this place. And I think all those kids there, they're going to all get blown up. And so I went with my conviction. The ending, of course, which has no titles. There were no titles in the beginning or at the end. As I said, people came to the film and they were given a program. And at the end, there is a moment hearkening back to that first scene in the beginning of the picture, and you hear the horror, and it's over. Now, after the movie was released in this 70mm big roadshowed way, of course, then it was shown all over the country. And when it was shown all over the country, they needed to put the titles on the film. And so we said, well, can we put the explosions that we blew up the temple, and then we'll put the titles on that? And I said, okay. But when I saw it, and when we began to show it around the country, it looked as though he did blow up the temple. And I said, I felt it was wrong to bring down the bombs, and I don't want to have the bombs. If people are going to misunderstand that the explosions are brought in by him, and that all those people, maybe some of them got blown up, I said, I'd rather just the credits be on black and put the names, and so that's the way it is. I felt too many people misunderstood the explosions, and that's why I took it off. But we did blow up that place. We had to blow it up because it was basically a huge stage set, or a movie set, and it was not legal for it to remain. It would have been dangerous, though it was very impressive. It looked like Angkor Wat. You make these decisions. I try to make decisions out of convictions. Don't kill the animal, let the real sacrifice take place, and don't make it look as though he called in the airstrike. And once again, just, because war is so exhilarating, have the ending be a big, explosive sequence, because, it used to be a battle and I had cut the battle out. And so the end credits, since it's not in a form of a program anymore, the end credits are done over black. I've been asked many times why I chose to call the version of the film Apocalypse Now Redux, and I'm not exactly sure I can remember why, except that sometimes when you do something unusual and you have to explain it, it's good to come up with a name that's different. So that Redux seemed to me a kind of rebirth of it, partly meaning that it was the real original version, or it was the full film, and also it differentiated it from Apocalypse Now. Mickey Hart had put together an extraordinary group of percussionists in the old Grateful Dead studio, and he called them the Rhythm Devils, and they went for session after session with actual projection of the film, with all of these percussionists working together, and you can hear this extraordinary percussion track throughout. Mickey Hart's contribution, really, to a very multi-layered quintaphonic soundtrack, and this was he and the Rhythm Devils, and many of the Rhythm Devils were famous percussionists or other band members from the Grateful Dead. Many, many, many people worked hard on this recreation of Apocalypse Now. Walter Murch was available and said that he would take a look at it with me. And Kim Aubrey, who was working with us, was willing to jump in and shepherd this and produce the new version. Vittorio Storaro came back from Rome and went through the negative and did a beautiful rebalancing of the color and supervising what the film would look like in this new, very deluxe version of Apocalypse Now. And of course, not in the original length, but now with many of the scenes that had been cut out, the real picture as it might have been had I not been so stunned by the group of distributors who were shocked at the strangeness of the film. I realized that, with time, the strangeness of art becomes absorbed by the audience, and that, in fact, 15 years later, the version we had put out on Apocalypse really wasn't so strange, and maybe the film could stand to have some of the other material put back, as I've always said that the far-out art of the past becomes the wallpaper of the future. Well, it's been interesting to remember this. A lot of the stories I've told you I had forgotten about and only came back. I'm sure I forgot other things that might have been interesting, but Apocalypse Now, like a number of the films in my life, had a tremendous effect, almost wrecked my life in a number of ways. It was long and difficult. I was way overextended, as you can imagine, but it's turned out that the film has been seen for, many, many years, and it's found its niche. I can remember that I was very depressed when I was in the Philippines because there were lots of articles in the paper that I would be sent and talking about how, this Francis Coppola is over there and he's sort of crazy and he's just doing this absurd movie. And, they were criticizing the fact that the movie was costing $30 million. And I thought, gee, they're making Superman at home for $30 million, and why is that all right? And I'm trying to make the first film made about the Vietnam experience and make it an artistic film. Why am I being ridiculed, and they're spending as much money on a guy who is flying around with a red cape? I don't understand. It's not even original. It was a comic book. I understood that what it really was about is it seemed that the fact that I was using large amounts of money in a seemingly irresponsible way was what really was bugging them and what I was being criticized about. And even the fact that it was my money didn't matter, because it's true, over my career I've made a couple of big movies that have cost a lot of money, and even some of them went over budget. Most of the time the ones that went over budget was my own money. I always tried to be very careful and responsible when I was making films for other people. So I leave that thought. I think what I'd like to do in the future is make little films.